Greetings, dear listener. I am Dr. John H. Watson, and I bid you welcome to the warmth of my study. Draw close to the fire, for tonight we trace the threads of a locked room that smelled of sulfur and copper, a death framed by superstition and 13 flickering flames. Before we open my journal, I must ask a favour of you. From which city are you listening to this broadcast tonight? And pray tell me, what is your favourite Sherlock Holmes story? Share your thoughts in the comments as we settle in. Now, let us return to Baker Street. The relentless drum of a London downpour beat against the window panes of 221B Baker Street on a particularly dreary Tuesday in November. I sat near the hearth, with the comforting scratch of my fountain pen serving as the only counterpoint to the storm outside. I was updating my medical ledgers, meticulously recording the mundane ailments of the season. There was a tedious case of winter influenza contracted by a clerk in the city, a sprained ankle belonging to a haberdasher on Oxford Street, and a rather persistent cough troubling a young governess in Mayfair. The smell of wet soot occasionally blew down the chimney, mingling with the sharp metallic scent of whatever chemical concoction my friend was brewing at his work table. A silver tray bearing the remnants of Mrs. Hudson's morning tea service sat forgotten on the sideboard, the porcelain cups cold and stained with dark rings. Holmes had spent the better part of the morning entirely silent, huddled over a heavy leather-bound scrapbook with a magnifying glass in one hand and a set of brass tweezers in the other. He was extracting microscopic flakes of dried mud from the gutter margins of an old newspaper clipping. I did not ask his purpose. Experience had taught me that patience was far more rewarding than an interrupted silence. I noted a slight cramping in my right hand, the legacy of an old Jezzail bullet from the Afghan campaign, and paused to rub the aching joint. The brass carriage clock on the mantel ticked softly, measuring out the quiet morning. It was a domestic tranquillity that I knew could not last. The atmosphere in the room was heavy, not merely with the barometric pressure of the autumn storm, but with the coiled spring energy of Sherlock Holmes lacking an active puzzle. The great detective without a crisis was a danger to himself and the upholstery, yet the puzzle was already ascending our stairs. The heavy, wet tread of footsteps hammered against the wooden risers, echoing through the house with an urgency that ignored our landlady's customary announcement. The door to our sitting room was thrown wide with a sudden, violent force that rattled the gas fixtures upon the walls. In the threshold stood a man entirely consumed by terror. As a medical man, my eyes immediately swept over him, cataloguing the physiological manifestations of his distress. His face was the colour of old parchment, drained of all vitality and heavily lined with exhaustion. His pupils were dilated to the point where his pale irises were barely visible, giving his eyes a wild, hollow appearance that bespoke deep trauma. He gasped for air in shallow, rapid bursts, his chest heaving irregularly. His hands clutched the lapels of his sodden woolen ulster with a tremor so severe that the heavy, damp fabric visibly vibrated. The rain dripped steadily from the brim of his ruined bowler hat, pooling onto the Turkish rug, but he seemed entirely oblivious to the cold and the wet. He brought with him the smell of wet earth, sour sweat, and sheer, unadulterated fear. Holmes did not look up from his microscope. He merely adjusted the brass dial with a steady hand. "Step inside, sir, and close the door," he said in a voice as calm and flat as a frozen pond. "You are letting in a severe draught, and your violent shivering is entirely detrimental to a coherent narrative." The man obeyed with mechanical stiffness, slamming the heavy door shut and leaning his weight against it, as if to bar entry to whatever invisible demons he believed were pursuing him up the staircase. "Mr. Holmes," he stammered, his voice cracking high in his throat, "you must help me. The devil himself has come to Harrington Manor. The curse of the mirror is real. He is dead. The master is dead. The master is dead. Take a breath. Watson, pour him a measure of brandy," Holmes commanded, finally rising from his chair and wiping his long fingers on a chemical-stained linen cloth. I rose instantly, fetched a heavy crystal glass from the cabinet, and poured a generous portion of our best spirit. I crossed the room and pressed the glass into the man's trembling fingers, carefully supporting his wrist so he would not spill the amber liquid. He drank it in one desperate, thoughtless swallow, his teeth chattering audibly against the rim of the glass. The strong alcohol momentarily shocked his nervous system into stillness, bringing a faint flush of colour back to his pallid cheeks. "Now," Holmes said, standing before the roaring fire with his hands clasped firmly behind his back, Identify yourself and strip away this supernatural nonsense immediately. The devil does not frequent the estates of Sussex, and curses do not possess the physical mass required to turn a brass doorknob. Give us facts, sir. I am Arthur Penhaligon, the man breathed, leaning heavily upon the high back of my armchair. I am, or rather I was, the personal secretary to Lord Harrington. Lord Harrington of the East India Company, Holmes mused, his sharp grey eyes narrowing slightly as he accessed his mental encyclopedia. A man whose vast wealth was only eclipsed by his reputation for acquiring rare antiquities of highly dubious origin. A collector of forbidden histories. Proceed, Mr. Penhaligon. Penhaligon nodded, his erratic breathing slowly stabilizing under the weight of Holmes's unwavering, rational gaze. He had grown immensely paranoid these past few weeks. He spoke constantly of shadows moving in the gaslight of the long corridors, and of cold, sudden draughts that smelled of old graves and turned milk sour. Last night, he retreated early to his chambers and locked himself inside his private study. It is a formidable room constructed of solid stone and heavy timber. He took the heavy iron key with him. No one else has a copy. This morning, when he failed to answer my repeated summons, I became alarmed. The house staff were too frightened to assist, so I enlisted the help of the estate groundskeeper to break down the heavy oak door with a felling axe. Penhaligon paused, a fresh wave of terror washing over his features. He looked toward the rain-washed window, as if expecting a spectral face to peer back through the wet glass. His jaw trembled. "What did you find when the heavy door finally gave way?" I prompted, keeping my tone low, measured and reassuring, in the manner I adopted for shell-shocked soldiers. "The smell," Penhaligon whispered, his voice thick with remembered disgust. It was thick, cloying, like roasted meat and burnt sulfur. The room was perfectly sealed, Dr. Watson. The heavy sash windows were bolted from the inside. The iron chimney flue was closed and locked tight. Lord Harrington was seated in his high-backed leather chair, positioned directly in the centre of the room, facing the grand Elizabethan mirror. His eyes were wide open, staring intently into the dark glass. But he was quite dead. His face was contorted into a horrible mask of pure, unendurable agony. The blood vessels in his eyes had ruptured completely. Holmes stepped forward, his predatory interest finally ignited. A locked room, an unwounded corpse, and a terrified secretary. The stage is suitably set. But you mentioned a curse, Penhaligon. You burst into my rooms babbling of the devil. Penhaligon wiped a trembling, damp hand across his brow, smearing a streak of rainwater across his temple. It was the candles, Mr. Holmes. Lord Harrington was utterly obsessed with the occult arts. He had arranged 13 heavy wax candles in a perfect, mathematically precise semicircle upon the hardwood floor, directly between his chair and the mirror. When the groundskeeper and I broke down the door, they were still burning. 13 flames reflecting endlessly in the dark glass. It is an ancient summoning ritual I read about in his forbidden grimoires. He brought something through the mirror, and it took his soul right out of his body. "And the body?" I asked, stepping closer. "Were there any physical marks of violence upon the flesh? Any signs of asphyxiation, laceration, or the administration of poison?" "None," Penhaligon cried, his voice rising in panic once more. He was entirely untouched. Only his purpled face showed the sheer horror of his final moments. The local constabulary are already there, pacing the halls and whispering about angry ghosts and bad air. But I know what I saw in that room. The 13th candle, Mr. Holmes. The one positioned at the exact dead center, directly in front of the tall mirror. "What of it?" Holmes asked, his voice cracking sharp like a whip. "It was not burning like the others," Penhaligon said, his voice dropping back to a hoarse, frightened whisper. The 12 outer candles burned with a normal yellow flame, just simple fire. But the 13th candle, the centerpiece of the dark ritual, it was burning with a sickly, unnatural green light. It is the sign of the demonic, Mr. Holmes. A fire kindled by hell itself, a beacon to guide the spirit through the glass. Holmes stared at the terrified secretary for a long, silent moment. The silence in the Baker Street sitting room stretched, pulling taut until I felt my own pulse quicken in anticipation. The only sound was the rain lashing the glass and the soft crackle of the hearth. Then, quite suddenly, Holmes threw back his head and laughed. It was a brief, dry sound and laughed. It was a brief, dry sound, entirely devoid of any real amusement. Demonic magic, he said, shaking his head in mild disappointment. Oh, the human mind is a truly fascinating instrument, easily outmatched by its own primitive fears. Watson, your medical texts would find a psychological marvel in Mr. Penhaligon here. He sees the impossible, and his frantic mind desperately fills the void with sulfur and demons rather than logic. Penhaligon straightened up, his fear momentarily replaced by deep offence. I saw what I saw, sir. A green flame is not of this world. It is entirely of this world, Penhaligon, Holmes countered, his words precise, cold and unforgiving. A green flame is not the breath of the devil. It is the breath of cupric chloride. It is a fundamental, unyielding law of chemistry. When copper burns, it oxidizes rapidly and produces a brilliant, vivid green hue. A remarkably simple trick utilized by street pyrotechnicians and theatrical illusionists to astound the gullible. I saw the terrifying implication before Penhaligon did. Then the 13th candle was deliberately tampered with, Holmes. It was planted. Precisely, Watson, Holmes said, pacing the length of the Persian carpet with renewed energy. A paranoid man constructs a barricade, locks himself within a fortress of solid wood and stone, and engages in a parlour game of dark superstition. Someone in that household knew of his strange midnight habits. Someone knew of his strange midnight habits. Someone knew he would light those 13 candles in exact sequence. They deliberately replaced the central wax candle with one heavily laced with copper salts. But why? I asked, my mind racing over the anatomical possibilities. A sudden green flame might terribly frighten a highly superstitious man, but it cannot physically kill a healthy individual without leaving a mark. Holmes paused near his cluttered work table, his long, sensitive fingers lightly drumming against the heavy brass base of his microscope. You are looking at the mechanism of the trick, Watson, but ignoring the true purpose of the stagecraft entirely. The sudden green flame was not meant to kill Lord Harrington. It was meant to mesmerize him, to lock his attention onto the mirror, while the true murder weapon was quietly deployed from the shadows. Penhaligon stared at Holmes in total confusion. What weapon? The room was locked from the inside. No one came in or out. The windows were bolted completely tight. Holmes turned to face us, the dancing light of the gas lamp casting long, sharp shadows across his aquiline features. His eyes gleamed with the cold, hard logic of a hunting hound, finally catching the true scent of blood. You told me the sealed room smelled of roasted meat and burnt sulfur, Penhaligon, Holmes said, his voice dropping to a terrible, quiet intensity. The sulfur is easily explained as the mundane byproduct of the candle wax and the struck match. The smell of meat, however, is far more sinister in a locked room containing only one human occupant. Lord Harrington was not frightened to death by a haunted mirror or a summoned demon. He was cooked alive within his own skin. And the 13th candle, dear Watson, was not the murder weapon at all. It was the fuse. Chapter 2. The Chambron of Wyax. The urgent telegraph that summoned us from the familiar disarray of our Baker Street sitting room was characteristically brief, bearing the official stamp of Scotland Yard, and the frantic signature of Inspector Lestrade. It spoke only of a sudden demise and a locked room at the Harrington estate. The journey by train into the Thames Rally was accomplished in a profound and heavy silence. Holmes sat opposite me in the carriage, his sharp profile illuminated by the erratic flashes of passing station lights, his eyes fixed upon some invisible point in the middle distance. He had retreated into that state of cold, calculated detachment which always heralded the commencement of a complex inquiry. I did not interrupt his reverie. My own thoughts were occupied with the reputation of the late Lord Harrington, a man known equally for his vast colonial imports and his reclusive, almost paranoid habits. A hired carriage eventually ground its wheels against the damp gravel of the long approach to the estate, a sound that seemed abnormally loud in the muted grey of the morning. The Harrington residence was a formidable structure of pale, unyielding stone, set back from the river by a stretch of manicured but entirely lifeless lawn. There were no melodramatic storms to herald our arrival, no howling winds tearing at the eaves. There was only an absolute leaden stillness in the air, the oppressive quiet of an affluent household struck suddenly and violently by death. The heavy oak front doors swung open before our driver had even fully engaged the brake. We were greeted by a footman whose rigid spine and shallow, rapid breathing bespoke a man holding his faculties together by the thinnest margins of discipline. His skin possessed that distinct, bloodless quality I have so often observed in the triage tents of Afghanistan, a waxy pallor indicating a severe shock to the nervous system. Holmes handed his coat and hat to the trembling servant without uttering a single syllable of greeting. My friend was already absorbing the environment, his quick eyes darting across the entrance hall, registering the dust on the skirting boards, the exact angle of the Persian rugs, and the faint scuff marks upon the polished mahogany floor. We did not linger in the foyer. The footman, swallowing hard enough that the frantic motion was visible against his starched collar, led us up the sweeping central staircase. With every step we ascended toward the private quarters, a peculiar and deeply unsettling scent grew stronger. It was the heavy, cloying odour of rendered animal fat, specifically the sharp acridity of burnt tallow. Yet, threaded through this thick smoke was something far more unpleasant. It was the sour, metallic stench of human terror, a chemical miasma of cold sweat and voided bowels. It is a smell I know intimately from the battlefield, and its presence in this opulent domestic setting was profoundly disturbing. The door to Lord Harrington's private bedchamber stood slightly ajar. A uniformed constable stood guard outside, shifting his weight nervously from one foot to the other, looking as though he wished he were anywhere else in the Empire. Holmes dismissed the man with a curt nod and pushed the heavy door wide. We stepped into the room, and I immediately felt a physical weight press against my chest. The chamber was vast, furnished with the heavy velvet draperies and dark oak panelling typical of a man of Harrington's wealth and generation. Yet the atmosphere was stifling, almost unbreathable. The air was thick, stale, and unnaturally warm, clinging to the skin like a damp shroud. I moved immediately toward the great four-poster bed where the late lord lay, my professional medical instincts taking total precedence over the strangeness of the scene. Harrington was a man of perhaps 60 years, of robust, barrel-chested build, now collapsed among the violently disordered silk sheets. His posture was wholly unnatural, the limbs contorted and rigid in a manner that suggested a sudden, agonizing spasm rather than any peaceful passing in his sleep. I bent over him, carefully noting the physiological signs. His eyes were wide and bloodshot, the conjunctiva marked by tiny, ruptured capillaries. These petechial hemorrhages are a classic, undeniable indicator of severe respiratory distress or sudden asphyxiation. His lips and the nail beds of his stiffening fingers were deeply cyanotic, bearing a pronounced bluish-purple hue that contrasted sharply with his pale skin. Yet, as I unbuttoned the collar of his nightshirt and gently palpated his neck, I found nothing. There was no blood, no wound, no sign of blunt force trauma, and absolutely no bruising to suggest manual strangulation or the use of a ligature. The skin of his throat was perfectly unblemished. I placed a hand against his shoulder joint. Rigor mortis was fully established in the upper body and jaw, placing the time of death securely in the early hours of the previous night. Holmes, meanwhile, had not given the corpse more than a passing, perfunctory glance. His interest lay entirely in the periphery of the room, in the structural boundaries, the absences, and the anomalies. He stalked along the perimeter of the chamber like a hound on a scent, his shoulders hunched, his silver magnifying glass held tightly in his right hand. He stopped at the heavy sash windows, running his long, sensitive fingers along the frames, inspecting the sills and the brass latches. "The windows are locked from the inside, Watson," he said, his voice flat, precise, and entirely devoid of resonance. "Furthermore, they have been wedged. Observe the tiny slivers of pine wood driven into the sash cords. The main door, too, fits perfectly flush against its frame, and I noted a strip of felt tacked to the bottom edge. Someone went to extraordinary lengths to ensure this room was entirely hermetically sealed. But why?" I asked, straightening up from my grim examination of the corpse. "The man appears to have suffocated, Holmes. The petechiae in the eyes and the cyanosis of the extremities point invariably to a total cessation of oxygen. Yet there is no mark of violence upon him, unless he was smothered with a pillow, which the chaotic state of the bedclothes might suggest, though I see no fibres in his mouth or nostrils to support such a theory. Your medical deductions are, as always, meticulously observed but entirely misapplied to the broader circumstances," Holmes replied, not turning around to face me. "Look at the fireplace, Watson. Tell me what you see." I crossed the room to where Holmes now crouched before the grand marble hearth. The grate was completely empty, swept scrupulously clean of all ashes and coals. Above the mantelpiece hung an enormous, heavily carved mirror in a frame of dark, varnished mahogany that must have weighed half a ton. It dominated the wall, reflecting the grim, distorted tableau of the bedchamber back at us. Upon the white marble mantel, arranged in a perfectly straight, deliberate line directly beneath the glass, were 13 puddles of congealed wax. "They are candles," I said, studying the shapeless, greasy blobs. Or rather, they were. "They have burned down entirely to the bare marble." "Exactly," Holmes said, his eyes glittering with that suppressed, restless energy I knew so well. 13 tallow candles, completely and utterly consumed. Note the pooling of the wax, Watson. It has spread evenly in perfect concentric circles, which indicates there was absolutely no draught in this room whatsoever. The flames burned straight and true until they exhausted their fuel and extinguished themselves. I frowned, looking from the strange waxy altar back to the dead man on the bed. A man sealing himself in a room to burn 13 candles until they expire, it smacks of some bizarre occult ritual. Perhaps a sudden madness took him, driving him to lock out the world and suffocate himself. "Madness is loud, Watson. Madness is chaotic," Holmes countered swiftly. "This room is methodical. This is calculated, cold-blooded murder." He stood up, his piercing gaze fixed on the enormous mirror. He leaned in close, his nose nearly touching the silvered glass. He moved his head slowly, methodically, from left to right, inspecting the lower edge of the frame just inches above the wax puddles. I watched as his sharp, hawkish features tightened into a mask of pure concentration. He pulled a slim silver penknife from his waistcoat pocket and gently scraped at a minute speck on the glass. "Smell the blade," he commanded, offering the knife backward toward me. I leaned forward and sniffed the metallic edge. It carried a fine, greasy, bitter residue. "It is soot," I confirmed. "Confirmed. From the burning candles." "Indeed, but observe the pattern upon the glass, Doctor. There is a faint, almost imperceptible film of soot directly above 12 of the 13 wax puddles. The puddle precisely in the center, the 7th from either end, has left absolutely no mark upon the mirror." I stepped closer, adjusting my vision to the dim light of the single gas lamp we had ignited upon entering. It was exactly as he said. There was a microscopic absence of evidence. The smoke from the 7th candle had completely vanished without touching the glass. Perhaps the central candle was of a different make, I suggested, trying to apply logic to the absurdity. Or perhaps it burned at a lower temperature, producing less smoke. A fair hypothesis, but look closer, Watson. Look at the mirror frame directly behind its 7th puddle. I leaned in, straining my eyes against the dark grain of the mahogany and the smooth, reflective surface of the mirror. At first I saw nothing but our own distorted reflections. Then, catching a slight irregularity where the silvering met the wood, I saw it. Directly behind where the flame of the central candle would have flickered, there was a hole. It was impossibly small, no larger than the circumference of a steel knitting needle, bored cleanly through the thick glass of the mirror and the heavy wood of the backing. "Good God, Holmes," I breathed, feeling a sudden chill despite the stifling heat of the room. "A drill hole, bored with a diamond-tipped jeweler's bit given the flawlessly clean edges of the glass," Holmes muttered, his long fingers tracing the invisible circumference in the air, "and executed with supreme agonizing patience so as not to crack the pane or alert the occupant of the room. This was not done in a single night. This required unfettered access, ample time, and absolute silence." "But to what end?" I asked, stepping back from the oppressive piece of furniture. "A peephole? It is far too small for the human eye to see through effectively, and it looks directly into the wall." Holmes did not answer immediately. He dropped to his knees and examined the wainscoting beneath the mirror, tapping the wood with his knuckles. It produced a solid, unyielding, heavy sound. He stood up and began to pace the length of the room, his footsteps muffled by the thick Turkish carpet. The scent of burnt tallow seemed to grow thicker with his movement, coating the back of my throat with a greasy, nauseating film. "Let us review the undeniable facts, Watson," he said, his pace quickening. "Lord Harrington is found dead of sudden asphyxiation in a room meticulously sealed from the inside. 13 candles are arranged and burned to the very nub. A microscopic hole is drilled through a heavy mirror, directly at the exact level of a candle flame. We have a sealed environment, a gradual consumption of oxygen, and a single tiny conduit to whatever lies behind that wall." "He believed the hole was used to draw the air from the room?" I asked, trying to grasp the mechanical engineering of such a device. "A vacuum pump connected to the wall cavity? Through a hole the size of a pin? No, Watson. The basic laws of physics forbid it. It would take a pneumatic machine of enormous industrial power and days of continuous operation to suffocate a man of Harrington's size through such a minute aperture. Furthermore, the absence of soot above the central candle tells an entirely different story. I looked at the mirror again, my mind racing. The smoke was drawn into the hole. Exactly. The draught moved outward, into the wall. Or, to be fiercely precise, something drew the warm smoke in. Holmes stopped his pacing abruptly and stood completely still in the centre of the bedchamber. He closed his eyes, his head tilted back slightly, inhaling the stale, trapped air through his nose in short, rapid bursts. Tallow, he murmured. Sweat. Fear. The smells of human panic and cheap fat. And yet, there is something else. Do you smell it, Watson? Beneath the fat and the terror, isolate the scents. I took a deep, reluctant breath, forcing my medical training to isolate the olfactory threads hanging in the oppressive chamber. Past the copper tang of fear and the heavy grease, there was a faint, earthy musk. It was something sharp, dry, and distinctly organic, reminiscent of crushed dry leaves and old sun-baked soil. It smells like the reptile house at the zoological gardens, I said, a sudden shudder working its way down my spine as I recognized the distinct, dry acidity of the scent. Holmes's eyes snapped open. His gaze locked onto the tiny hole in the mirror with the intensity of a striking falcon. "You have hit the very nail, my dear doctor," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous silken whisper. The room was not sealed to keep Lord Harrington safely inside. It was sealed to ensure that whatever was waiting patiently behind that mirror had only one source of fresh air, and one very specific, heated path to follow when the candles burned low and the warmth drew it out from the darkness. I stared at the tiny dark aperture in the glass. A sudden, freezing dread pulling in the pit of my stomach. The silence of the great house pressed in upon us, no longer empty, but pregnant with the horrific implication of what might still be lurking in the walls. "If the draught drew the smoke in, Watson," Holmes said, his eyes utterly cold and unblinking in the gloom, "we must ask ourselves what manner of creature requires a heated conduit, fits seamlessly through a hole a fraction of an inch wide, and possesses a venom potent enough to arrest a man's lungs forever without leaving a single mark upon his flesh." Chapter 3. The glass of Chaudes. The damp chill of the London afternoon had settled deep into the marrow of my bones by the time our hansom cab rattled over the slick, uneven carbon torn. The market, which in the morning hours was a vibrant, chaotic riot of costermongers, flower girls and shouting merchants, was now entirely subdued under a heavy, sulphurous yellow fog. This suffocating vapour choked the gas lamps down to mere pinpricks of weak amber, casting long, unnatural shadows across the deserted piazza. The air hung thick and stagnant, carrying the sour scent of crushed cabbage leaves, damp earth, and the faint metallic tang of the distant Thames. Holmes moved with a predatory, silent grace through a disorienting maze of discarded wooden crates, overturned barrows, and abandoned market stalls. His tall, ascetic frame was tightly wrapped in his heavy ulster, the collar turned high against the biting, moisture-laden wind. I followed a few paces behind, my service revolver resting as a heavy, cold, and profoundly reassuring weight in the right pocket of my overcoat. Our destination was not located among the lively, well-lit storefronts facing the main thoroughfare, but was hidden away within a narrow, soot-stained alleyway that seemed designed to swallow whatever meagre light dared to penetrate the fog. We stopped before a shop front of rotting, water-logged mahogany. The window glass was so thick with centuries of grime and neglect that the curious oddities displayed within were reduced to misshapen, threatening silhouettes. A severely faded gilt sign above the heavy door simply read Josiah Penhaligon, Antiquities and Obscure Curiosities. The heavy wooden door opened with a prolonged groan of protesting iron hinges, followed by the dull, unenthusiastic clatter of a tarnished brass bell. We stepped over the threshold and into an atmosphere that was immediately and intensely suffocating. The interior of the shop smelled overwhelmingly of crushed camphor, decaying leather bindings, and the dry, sour dust of forgotten centuries. Tall, unsteady cabinets of dark wood loomed like silent sentinels in the pervasive gloom. They were violently crammed with cracked porcelain figures, heavily tarnished silverware, and bizarre taxidermy that had long since lost any semblance to natural life. The silence within the room was absolute, save for the erratic, unsynchronized ticking of a half-dozen mismatched long-case clocks that seemed to be measuring a time entirely separate from our own. Holmes stood perfectly still in the dead centre of the room. His piercing grey eyes darted rapidly from corner to corner, meticulously cataloguing every shadow, every displaced object, every disturbed patch of grey dust upon the warping floorboards. I waited by the door, observing a faint, erratic scratching sound originating from behind a hanging tapestry at the rear of the cramped shop. From behind a chaotic fortress of stacked, moth-eaten oriental rugs emerged the proprietor. He was a man of perhaps 60 years, though his defeated, ruined posture suggested a far greater burden of time and anxiety. As a medical man, I took immediate and professional note of his dire physical state. His skin possessed the translucent, waxy pallor of a fresh cadaver. His breathing was frighteningly rapid and shallow, barely expanding his sunken, narrow chest. A heavy sheen of cold, clammy perspiration had gathered at his receding temples and above his upper lip, despite the profoundly frigid temperature of the unheated shop. Most telling of all, however, was the violent, uncontrollable tremor in his hands. He made a vain, pathetic attempt to conceal this affliction by burying his knuckles deep into the pockets of his frayed, heavily stained velvet waistcoat. He was a man not merely nervous, but completely consumed by a profound and paralyzing terror. He did not offer a customary greeting. His eyes, dark, sunken, and darting like a trapped rodent, flicked over my face for a fraction of a second before locking onto Holmes. The detective stepped forward, his manner abruptly cold and strictly businesslike, abandoning any pretense of casual browsing. "We are seeking exact information regarding a highly specific item," Holmes stated, his sharp voice cutting clean through the heavy, dusty silence. A heavy-looking glass, framed in dark and unpolished bronze, bearing the very distinct and unusual motif of 13 half-melted candles around its perimeter. The physical reaction to these precisely chosen words was instantaneous and medically alarming. Penhaligon staggered violently backward, his fragile spine colliding with a heavy grandfather clock, setting its heavy brass pendulum knocking wildly against the wooden casing. A choked, wet gasp escaped his throat, sounding like a man suddenly plunged into freezing water. The violent tremor in his hands spread rapidly upward through his arms to his shoulders. I stepped forward instinctively, bracing my legs, genuinely fearing the wretched man might collapse into a full cardiovascular syncope right there on the shop floor. "I have nothing to say on that matter to you or anyone else," Penhaligon stammered, his voice reduced to a dry, rasping, terrified whisper. "The piece you describe is gone. It left this establishment weeks ago. I know absolutely nothing of its current whereabouts, and I do not wish to know." Holmes did not press him immediately. He understood perfectly well that terror is a locked door, and one must find the right key rather than batter it down. Instead, he began to slowly, deliberately pace the narrow, cluttered aisle, pausing to casually inspect a dusty shelf laden with cracked brass sextants. "You entirely misunderstand my purpose, Mr. Penhaligon. I care absolutely nothing for its current whereabouts. I know exactly where the glass is resting at this very moment. I also know precisely what it was intended to reflect, and the grotesque tragedy it so recently oversaw in Mayfair. My interest lies entirely and exclusively in its origin. You did not craft that heavy bronze frame yourself. You do not possess the deep, scarred calluses of a master metalworker, nor do you bear the tiny telltale acid burns of a bronzesmith upon your forearms. You are merely a broker of unusual things. But you know exactly who commissioned the piece, and you know who brought it through your door." The aging antiquarian shook his head violently from side to side. His eyes widened to an unnatural degree until the bloodshot white showed continuously all around his pale irises. "You do not understand the dark forces you are blindly probing, sir. It was brought to me completely wrapped in heavy black oilcloth, in the absolute dead of a moonless night, by a man who spoke not a single word of English. I was paid a vast, unreasonable sum in unmarked gold merely to hold the object safe until the appointed buyer arrived to claim it. But you do not understand the worst of it. It was not just one glass. It was never just one." Holmes stopped his measured pacing instantly. He turned slowly on his heel, his sharp aquiline profile caught sharply in the dim, flickering light of a single gas jet sputtering poorly on the damp brick wall. "Explain yourself clearly," he commanded, his voice dropping an octave, carrying the weight of absolute authority. Penhaligon swallowed hard, his throat working convulsively, his eyes fixed on the floorboards as if terrified to meet Holmes' gaze. "It was a pair," the proprietor whispered, his voice trembling so badly I had to lean forward to catch the words. Two perfectly identical mirrors, cast from the exact same mould, bound together by the same terrible, intricate design. The frame of 13 candles you found was not a complete piece unto itself. It was only half of a greater whole. It was a dual commission, carefully designed and engineered by the maker to perfectly face one another. Holmes stood absolutely motionless. When he finally spoke, his tone was entirely devoid of his usual dramatic flair. He was stating facts as they assembled themselves in his extraordinary mind. A custom pair, facing mirrors. When placed exactly opposite one another, they create an infinite regression, an endless, repeating corridor of reflections stretching into an artificial eternity. Such an arrangement is generally meant to trap a specific light, or perhaps, in the minds of the superstitious, to create a corridor to let something through. Who currently holds the second glass, Mr. Penhaligon? The terrified proprietor covered his face entirely with his trembling, liver-spotted hands. I do not know. I swear it. Upon my immortal soul, I do not know. The second mirror was collected 3 nights before the first one was claimed. The man who came to take it paid the balance in ancient gold sovereigns. He wore a remarkably heavy, dark overcoat and a wide-brimmed felt hat pulled low. He brought an intense, sickening odour of cold ash and sweet funeral spices into my shop, a scent that lingered in the corners for days after he departed. I never once saw his face. I was explicitly and violently instructed never to look upon him. I observed Holmes closely from my position by the door. His formidable intellect was furiously at work, rapidly assembling these new disturbing fragments of the puzzle into a cohesive picture. Seeking to give Penhaligon a moment to recover his failing breath, I stepped toward the glass front counter to examine an open, leather-bound ledger, intending to see if any written record of this bizarre transaction had been foolishly kept. As I moved laterally across the room, my line of sight accidentally aligned directly with the filthy, unwashed front window of the shop. Across the narrow, fog-choked alleyway, squeezed tightly into an alcove between the damp, weeping brick walls of an abandoned warehouse, stood a solitary figure. It was entirely motionless, a dark, heavy silhouette seemingly carved directly from the surrounding grey vapour. I could easily make out the heavy, straight drape of a long, dark overcoat and the sharp, obscured angle of a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over the brow. Absolutely no facial features were visible in the gloom, yet the sheer, concentrated intensity of the figure's absolute stillness conveyed an immediate and unmistakable malice. A cold, sharp prickle of pure alarm travelled rapidly down my spine. "Holmes," I murmured, keeping my voice perfectly level and devoid of sudden inflection so as not to alert our observer. Holmes did not turn his head even a fraction of an inch, but his grey eyes shifted instantly and precisely toward the grimy window glass. He remained perfectly still, his posture completely relaxed, his hands resting easily in his pockets. Yet, having known the man for years, I knew with absolute certainty that every muscle in his lean, athletic frame was now coiled tight, like a heavy steel spring. "I see him, Watson," he replied softly, his lips barely moving. The watcher across the alley did not flinch or retreat. He seemed entirely and brazenly unconcerned that he had been clearly spotted by 2 alert men. It was a supreme, chilling arrogance of an apex predator patiently observing its chosen prey from a position of absolute safety. Penhaligon, having suddenly caught the terrifying direction of our fixed gaze, let out a pathetic, high-pitched whimper. He dropped instantly to his knees behind the heavy wooden counter, curling into a tight ball and pressing his hands violently over his ears, as if trying to physically block out the very existence of the outside world. "Let us step outside, Watson," Holmes said quietly, his voice now betraying a quiet, intensely dangerous thrill. I immediately drew my heavy service revolver, half out of my coat pocket, my thumb sliding over the cold metal to ensure the hammer was entirely free of catching on the interior fabric. We moved together with synchronized precision toward the front door. Holmes threw it open with a sudden, violent crack, and we stepped quickly out into the biting, damp chill of the alleyway. The heavy fog rolled past us in sluggish yellow waves. The narrow space within the alcove between the brick walls directly across the street was completely empty. The dark figure had vanished with absolute unnatural silence. There were no retreating, echoing footsteps striking the wet cobblestones. There was no distinct rustle of heavy wool brushing against rough brick. There was no sound of a closing door. There was only the hollow, rhythmic dripping of heavy condensation falling from the rotting wooden eaves above us. Holmes crossed the narrow, muddy alley in 3 remarkably long, rapid strides. He crouched low in the thick muck, exactly where the dark figure had stood mere seconds before, seamlessly pulling a small, powerful magnifying glass from his interior waistcoat pocket. He remained there in the dirt for a long, silent moment, entirely ignoring the cold damp seeping rapidly into the knees of his trousers. When he finally stood straight, his sharp features were drawn tight, and his expression was completely unreadable. "What do you see?" I asked sharply, keeping my right hand firmly gripping my hidden weapon, my eyes constantly and anxiously scanning the dense rooftop shadows above us. "No footprints whatsoever, Watson. The uneven cobblestones in this specific alcove are slick with thick, undisturbed mud, yet the surface is absolutely pristine. Our bold watcher either possesses the miraculous gift of complete levitation, or he somehow stepped directly backward through the heavily rusted, solid iron grate behind him without disturbing a single fragile flake of red oxidation. Neither scenario is physically or scientifically probable." We walked slowly back toward the glowing window of the antique shop, the thick atmosphere around us now heavy with an unspoken, creeping dread. The terrible realization of what the terrified proprietor had just told us began to weigh heavily upon my rational mind. A matched pair of mirrors. If the first glass had already driven a prominent man to such a grotesque, violent, and utterly inexplicable demise in his own locked study, what specific horror was the second glass currently reflecting? Holmes paused deliberately at the threshold of the shop, turning to look back one final time into the swirling, impenetrable fog of the alleyway. He reached slowly into his pocket and produced a single crushed object he had just retrieved from the undisturbed mud. He held it up to the dim, flickering amber light spilling from the shop window. It was the dried, perfectly preserved husk of a strange, pale, unidentifiable flower. Even from a foot away, I could clearly detect the faint, sickening odor radiating from the dead petals. It smelled intensely of cold, wet ash and heavily sweet funeral spices. "The heavy bronze frame of 13 candles is not the weapon, Watson," Holmes said quietly, his steely eyes fixed intently on the empty, fog-filled space where the impossible figure had stood. "It is the door, and heaven help this city. Someone has just opened the other side." Chapter 4. The Nepizza's deed. The acrid scent of burnt rosin and strong shag tobacco greeted me as I pushed open the door to our sitting room at Baker Street. The air was thick, carrying a sharp metallic tang that spoke of some recent and volatile chemical inquiry. Holmes sat cross-legged upon the hearthrug, a glass retort balanced precariously over the blue flame of a spirit lamp. He did not look up as I removed my overcoat, though the subtle tilt of his head indicated he was entirely aware of my arrival. I walked to the sideboard, poured a measure of soda water to clear the soot of the London streets from my throat, and turned to my companion. I had spent the better part of the morning tracing the movements of the late Lord Harrington's estranged nephew, a young man by the name of Arthur, and the ledger of his recent activities was grim. "You step heavily, Watson," Holmes said at last, his eyes still fixed upon the bubbling amber fluid in his retort. "It is the tread of a man burdened by the weight of damning facts. I take it your visit to the wagering establishments of St. James was fruitful." I sat in my armchair and laid my notebook upon the table. Fruitful and troubling. Arthur Harrington is a man entirely drowning in his own vices. I spoke with a marker at the Pelican Club, a fellow I once treated for a bout of erysipelas, who proved remarkably forthcoming. Arthur is in debt to the tune of £5,000. He plays faro with a desperation that borders on madness, and his creditors have ceased to be polite gentlemen with ledgers. They are now men of rougher trades who wait in alleyways. "A powerful motive for a sudden inheritance," Holmes murmured, lifting the lamp away from the glass. The flame died with a soft hiss. "What else?" I leaned forward, tapping the leather cover of my notebook. "It is not merely the money, Holmes." After I left the club, I paid a visit to the antiquarian booksellers along Charing Cross Road, specifically a cramped little shop owned by a Mr. Penhaligon, known for trading in obscure and unsavoury literature. He remembered Arthur Harrington well. 3 days ago, the young man purchased a 17th-century grimoire. Holmes finally turned his face toward me. His grey eyes were unusually bright, the listlessness of the morning entirely banished. "The title, Watson." "The Umbra Principis," I replied. Penhaligon hesitated to admit it, but a sovereign loosened his tongue. He described the contents to me. "It is a treatise on the summoning of ancient debts, detailing rituals that involve precise geometrical arrangements. Most damningly, It contains a specific chapter on the binding of souls using silvered glass and 13 tapers. The precise arrangement found in Lord Harrington's study. Holmes stood, uncoiling his long limbs with the sudden energy of a hound catching a scent. You walked to the window, pulling back the heavy curtain to peer into the gloom of Baker Street. The rain had begun to fall again, slicking the cobblestones and haloing the gas lamps in the failing afternoon light. Get your hat, Watson. The time for tracing ledgers is done. We must look upon the face of this desperate young man. The hansom cab rattled over the uneven streets toward Mayfair, the cold damp seeping through the floorboards. I found myself running over the facts in my mind. The nephew had the motive of ruinous debt, the means to access the house through his familial connection, and now he possessed the esoteric knowledge required to stage the grotesque tableau we had discovered in the study. To my medical and military mind, the diagnosis was clear. We were travelling to apprehend a murderer. Arthur Harrington's lodgings were situated in a respectable but decaying terrace off Half Moon Street. The paint was peeling from the front door, and the brass knocker was dull with neglect. A sour-faced landlady admitted us, gesturing toward the first-floor landing with a dismissive wave of a soapy hand. We did not knock. Holmes turned the handle and pushed the door open, stepping into a room that reeked of stale brandy, cold cigars, and the distinct sour odour of unwashed linen. Arthur Harrington was slumped in a wing-back chair by an empty fireplace. He was a man in his late 20s, but dissipation had aged him prematurely. As a doctor, I immediately noted the signs of severe nervous exhaustion. His skin was the colour of old parchment, drawn tight over the bones of his face. The pupils of his eyes were dilated, and a fine, persistent tremor shook his right hand, which clutched a half-empty glass of spirits. He wore a dressing gown of expensive silk, but it was stained and frayed at the cuffs. "Who the devil are you?" he snarled, half rising from his chair before sinking back into the cushions. "How dare you force your way into my rooms?" Holmes stood near the centre of the room, his posture rigid, his gaze sweeping over the cluttered tables, the spilled ash, the discarded betting slips scattered across the rug like fallen leaves. "I am Sherlock Holmes, and this is Dr. Watson. We are here on behalf of Scotland Yard, and on behalf of your late uncle." The mention of Lord Harrington caused a violent spasm to cross the young man's face. It was a mixture of fear, revulsion, and a sudden defensive anger. He set his glass down on the side table with a sharp clatter. "My uncle is dead," Arthur said, his voice ragged. "I read of it in the evening papers. A tragedy, a terrible tragedy. But I have nothing to say to the police, nor to amateur meddlers. We had not spoken in 2 years. You did not speak," Holmes said, his voice cold and flat, "but you did visit him. On Tuesday evening, perhaps, to ask for a sum to satisfy the men who have been pacing outside this very building for the past week." Arthur's pallor deepened. A bead of perspiration broke out upon his temple, catching the meagre light from the window. "I did no such thing. I was at my club all of Tuesday evening. You may ask the steward." "I have already asked the steward," I interjected, stepping forward. "You were absent from the Pelican Club from 8 o'clock until past midnight." The young man glared at me, his breathing becoming shallow and rapid. "You have been spying on me, both of you. It is no crime to leave a club. I took a walk. I needed air." "Did you also need the 17th century grimoire you purchased from Mr. Penhaligon?" Holmes asked. The question was delivered softly, but it struck the room with the force of a physical blow. Arthur flinched. The tremor in his hand worsened, and he quickly tucked it into the pocket of his dressing gown. "Books are entirely lawful to purchase. I have an interest in antiquities. It is a hobby that miraculously aligns with the bizarre and theatrical manner of your uncle's death," Holmes observed. 13 candles, a mirror tipped forward, a ritual of binding. You are in desperate need of £5,000. Your uncle, a wealthy man, refuses your pleas. 2 days later, he is dead, surrounded by the exact esoteric staging described in a book you secretly acquired. I did not kill him. Arthur stood up, his voice cracking into a high, panicked register. I hated him, yes. He was a miser, a cruel, cold-blooded old man who watched me drown in debt and offered nothing but lectures on morality. But I did not touch him. I swear it. Holmes stepped closer to the young man. He did not raise his voice, but the intensity of his focus was suffocating. "Then why did you buy the book, Arthur?" Arthur opened his mouth, closed it, and looked away. The silence in the room stretched, heavy and oppressive. The ticking of a mantel clock sounded unnaturally loud. He was a man caught in a trap, and yet there was something in his eyes that struck me not as the cunning of a cornered murderer, but the sheer, blind panic of a fool. "I bought it for a gentleman," Arthur whispered at last, his gaze fixed upon the floorboards. "A collector. He approached me at the club. He knew of my debts. He offered me £50 simply to acquire the book from Peneligon, as the dealer refused to sell to him directly due to some past quarrel." "The name of this gentleman?" Holmes demanded. "I do not know it," Arthur cried out, his voice tinged with genuine despair. "He was tall. He wore a heavy ulster coat and a wide-brimmed hat. He paid in cash, took the wrapped parcel, and I never saw him again. That is the truth. Now get out of my rooms, both of you." Holmes stared at the trembling figure for a long, silent moment. Then, without a word, he turned on his heel and walked out the door. I followed close behind, leaving the ruined young man to his brandy and his terrors. The rain had stopped by the time we reached the street, leaving the air damp and smelling of wet soot. I hailed a passing cab, my mind firmly made up. "It is a pathetic lie," I said as we climbed into the carriage. "A mysterious stranger in a wide-brimmed hat, buying forbidden texts. It is the oldest and weakest defense a guilty man can muster. He has the motive, the means, and the opportunity. Scotland Yard must be notified at once to make the arrest before he attempts to flee the city." Holmes settled back against the leather squabs, pulling his coat tight around his shoulders. His profile was sharp against the passing street lamps. His eyes narrowed in deep, restless contemplation. "You see a perfect suspect, Watson," he said quietly. "I see a man whose guilt is written plainly upon his trembling hands and evasive tongue," I countered. "Exactly," Holmes replied, turning his head to look at me in the dim light. "It is written plainly, too plainly. Arthur Harrington is a weak, frightened creature. Lacks the nerve for violence, and more importantly, he lacks the meticulous, cold-blooded intellect required to construct the scene in that study. The candles were measured to burn down at precise intervals. The mirror was angled with mathematical exactitude. That was the work of a calm, calculating mind. Then you believe his story about the stranger." "I believe Arthur Harrington was used, Watson. Used by someone who knew his debts, knew his connection to the victim, and needed a convenient fool to purchase the instrument of the crime." Holmes reached into his pocket and drew out a small, crumpled piece of paper, smoothing it upon his knee. "What is that?" I asked, leaning closer as the cab rattled beneath a gas lamp. "I lifted it from the ashtray by Arthur's fireplace while you were pressing him on his club attendance," Holmes said. "It is a telegram receipt, received by Arthur this very morning." I squinted at the faded blue ink in the shifting shadows of the cab. "The text, Watson, reads as follows: 'Your uncle is dead. The debt is transferred. Await instructions.'" Holmes folded the paper and slipped it back into his pocket. His voice dropped to a low, chilling whisper. "We are not hunting a desperate nephew, Watson. We are hunting the man who now owns him." Chapter 5. The Tierton Thame Inspector Lestrade possessed Inspector Lestrade possessed a singular talent for ignoring the profound in favour of the obvious. He paced the worn rug of our Baker Street sitting room with the triumphant energy of a hound that had treed a very small and frightened cat. In his hand he held the preliminary paperwork for an arrest warrant, the ink barely dry, the name of Arthur Pendleton inscribed with heavy, decisive strokes. Beside the fire, Sherlock Holmes sat curled in his armchair, his eyes half closed, his long, pale fingers steepled beneath his chin. The air in the room was thick with the acrid smoke of shag tobacco, a sure sign that my friend was retreating into the inner chambers of his mind while the Scotland Yard man celebrated his premature victory. Lestrade detailed his theory with characteristic bluntness. Arthur stood to inherit a substantial fortune upon his uncle's demise. Arthur possessed gambling debts which he had sought to conceal, a fact Lestrade had uncovered through an informant in the rookeries of Soho. Arthur lacked a robust alibi for the hours during which the older man had met his peculiar end. Therefore, Lestrade concluded, bringing his fist down upon the back of a dining chair, Arthur was the murderer, employing an elaborate and macabre staging to disguise a simple mercenary crime as the work of a lunatic. I watched Holmes for any reaction. Not a muscle twitched in his sharp, ascetic face. He allowed Lestrade to finish his summation, letting the silence stretch until the inspector shifted uncomfortably from one foot to the other. When Holmes finally spoke, his voice was low and perfectly flat. "You construct a magnificent edifice upon a foundation of sand, Lestrade. You ask me to believe that a man desperate for immediate funds, driven by the panicked urgency of a gambling debt, would take the time to procure a rare antique mirror, transport it unseen, and meticulously light 13 candles around the corpse. You ask me to ignore the ritual in favour of the ledger." Lestrade bristled, his face colouring. "Murderers attempt all sorts of foolishness to throw us off the scent, Mr. Holmes. It is a distraction, nothing more. It is a distraction, nothing more. It is the entire case," Holmes replied, his eyes snapping open. "The inheritance is the distraction. The mirrors are the motive." But before I could ask him to elaborate, the heavy tread of hurried boots sounded on the stairs. Mrs. Hudson did not even have the opportunity to announce our visitor. The door was flung open by a young, breathless constable, his helmet askew, his uniform damp with the chill mist of the London afternoon. He locked eyes with Lestrade, delivering his message in a rush of panicked syllables. "It is the nephew, sir. Arthur Pendleton. The housekeeper found him not 20 minutes ago. You must come at once." Lestrade puffed out his chest. "Fleeing the country, is he? Or attempting to destroy evidence?" "Dying, sir," the constable gasped. "Poisoned, the surgeon reckons." The inspector stood frozen, the unserved warrant suddenly heavy and absurd in his hand. Holmes was already out of his chair, reaching for his greatcoat and his Inverness cape with a fluidity of motion that belied his previous lethargy. "The game has turned, Watson," he said over his shoulder. "Bring your bag. We are dealing with a sequence, not a solitary event." The cab ride to Arthur Pendleton's residence in Kensington was accomplished in a strained, heavy silence. The rattle of the iron-shod wheels over the cobblestones seemed to beat a frantic rhythm against the glass. I watched the gas lamps flare and fade in the fog, my mind racing through the medical possibilities of the summons. A poisoner who operated with such theatrical flair would not choose a simple, agonizing corrosive. They would choose something subtle, something that allowed the staging of the scene to take precedence over the messy reality of death. Arthur Pendleton's house was a handsome, narrow terrace, but its current atmosphere was one of profound disruption. A cluster of frightened servants stood weeping in the hallway. A local physician, a flustered man with mutton-chop whiskers, met us at the top of the stairs, looking profoundly relieved to surrender the responsibility of the patient to another medical man. I stepped into the study, and the breath caught in my throat. The room was stiflingly hot, the air utterly devoid of moisture and heavy with the cloying sweet scent of burning beeswax. There, positioned in the exact center of the Persian rug, was a heavy, ornate mirror frame, practically identical to the one we had discovered at the first scene. Surrounding it, burning with perfectly steady, unwavering flames, were 13 tall white candles, and slumped in a high-backed leather chair facing this grim arrangement was Arthur himself. I moved to him immediately, dropping my bag to the floor. The young man was a ghastly sight. His skin held the cold, damp pallor of sculpted marble, utterly drained of blood. His head rolled limply against the leather, his jaw slack. I placed my fingers against the carotid artery. The pulse was there, but it was a fretty, erratic flutter, like the wings of a dying moth. I leaned close to his face, listening to his respiration. It was shallow, painfully slow, separated by terrifyingly long pauses. I gently lifted one of his eyelids. The pupil was contracted to the size of a pinhead, entirely unresponsive to the ambient light of the candles. I bent my head, bringing my face near his mouth, and caught a faint, unmistakable odour. It was not the bitter almonds of prussic acid, nor the metallic tang of arsenic. It was an earthy, heavy scent, reminiscent of damp soil and decaying root. "Opiate poisoning," I stated, raising my voice to carry over the heavy silence of the room. "A massive, concentrated dose of a morphine derivative, likely ingested in a liquid form. He is experiencing profound respiratory depression. His lungs are forgetting how to draw air." "Can you save him, Watson?" Holmes asked. He was not looking at Arthur, but was instead crawling along the perimeter of the candlelit circle, his magnifying glass already in hand. "I need strong coffee," I ordered the weeping housekeeper, hovering in the doorway. "And fetch me a basin of cold water and towels. We must keep him awake, or at least stimulate his nervous system enough to keep his heart beating." I set about preparing a hypodermic injection of atropine from my bag, a desperate countermeasure to the paralyzing grip of the narcotic. Lestrade stood in the corner of the room, looking thoroughly bewildered. "This makes no sense," he muttered. "If he is the killer, why would he take his own life in the exact manner of his victim? Remorse." Holmes paused his inspection of the floorboards and looked up, his grey eyes glinting with a dangerous cold light. "He did not take his own life, Inspector. Look at the desk." I glanced over my shoulder while administering the injection. The heavy oak desk was arranged with neat precision. A half-finished letter rested on a blotting pad. A fountain pen lay beside it, the ink still wet on the nib. A cut glass tumbler stood near the edge, containing a tiny remnant of amber liquid. A man intending to die does not pause mid-sentence in a letter to his tailor regarding the alteration of a shooting jacket, Holmes observed. Nor does he arrange 13 candles with mathematical precision after consuming a dose of poison that would render him unconscious within minutes. He was seated at his desk. He drank his evening whiskey, which had been thoroughly laced with Watson's opiate, as the paralysis took him, as his limbs grew heavy and his vision darkened. He was forced to watch his murderer step from the shadows, arrange this terrible stage, and light these flames one by one. A shiver passed through me that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. The cruelty of such an act was staggering. To drug a man into a state of helpless conscious paralysis, and then meticulously build a monument to his impending death before his fading eyes. I focused my attention entirely on Arthur, applying cold compresses to his neck and forehead, shouting his name, attempting to draw some flicker of consciousness from the void. The young man groaned, a low, terrible sound vibrating in his chest, but his eyes remained shut. He was teetering on the very edge of the precipice, and I was doing everything in my medical power to hold him back. Holmes moved gracefully around the candles, his tall, thin frame casting distorted, dancing shadows against the walls. He stopped before the antique mirror frame. It was a twin to the first, carved with the same twisting, thorny vines and dark, heavy wood. There was no glass within it. It framed only the dark leather of the chair and the slumped, dying form of the young man. "I was entirely wrong, Lestrade," Holmes said quietly. His voice held no triumph, only a grim, cold certainty. The first murder was not an isolated act of familial greed. It was the prologue. This mirror, this second frame, proves it. We are not hunting an heir desperate for coin. We are hunting an heir desperate for coin. We are hunting a collector. A collector of what? Lestrade asked, stepping forward, careful to avoid the burning wax. "A collector of vengeance," Holmes replied softly. He knelt so close to the mirror that his face was bathed in the warm yellow light of the candles. He produced a small tape measure from his pocket, measuring the distance between the base of the frame and the nearest candle. Exactly 4¼ inches. The same as the first scene. The same wax, a same braided wick. The murderer is operating under a strict, unyielding ritual, a compulsion that dictates every movement. He stood up slowly, his eyes fixed on the ornately carved wood of the frame. The inheritance was merely a circumstantial coincidence, a smokescreen that blinded us to the true nature of the crime. The target is not the Pendleton fortune. The target is anyone who came into possession of these specific mirrors. "But why?" I asked, my fingers still pressing firmly against Arthur's fading pulse. "What is the significance of the frames?" "That, Watson, is the very question upon which Arthur's life, and perhaps others, now depends," Holmes said. He reached out with one gloved finger and traced a deep, deliberate gouge in the dark wood of the frame, a mark that looked violently out of place among the elegant carvings. He leaned in closer to the mark, his breath causing the nearest candle flame to shudder and dance. Holmes remained perfectly still for a long moment, staring at the gouge in the wood. When he finally spoke, his voice was hollow, stripped of its usual brisk authority. "The first mirror frame bore a single scratch upon its base. This frame bears 2. He slowly turned to face me, and the flickering light cast harsh, skeletal shadows across his features. "If the pattern holds, Watson, there is a third mirror in this set, and somewhere in London tonight, a 13th candle is waiting to be lit for its owner." Chapter 6. The Sins of the Fathers. The rhythmic, uneven drag of Arthur Harrington's breathing filled the stifling air of the bedchamber. It was a classic Shiner-Stokes pattern, the respirations building in a harsh crescendo before dropping away into terrifying, prolonged silences. I sat at his bedside, my fingers pressed to the radial artery at his wrist. His pulse was a thready, vanishing thing, fluttering beneath his pale skin like a trapped moth. I drew back his eyelid with my thumb. The pupil was sluggish. dilated far beyond what the dim gaslight of the room warranted. A faint rim of cyanosis tinged his lips, and his skin carried the cold, clammy texture of a man suspended on the very precipice of death. He had not spoken a word since he collapsed. I adjusted the heavy woolen blankets around his shoulders and stepped back, wiping my hands upon my handkerchief. The scent of bitter almonds and singed wax still clung to his garments, a lingering miasma of the night's horrors. Holmes stood by the window, his tall, gaunt frame silhouetted against the grey morning light filtering through the drawn curtains. He was entirely motionless, his chin resting upon his chest, his eyes fixed upon the rain-streaked glass. He did not ask for my medical opinion, and I did not offer it. We both knew the young man was drowning in his own body, pulled under by a tide we had yet to understand. "I will leave a trusted nurse from the hospital to watch over him," I said, breaking the oppressive silence. "There is nothing more my medicine bag can do for him at this juncture, Holmes. He requires time and perhaps a miracle." "Miracles are the resort of the lazy mind, Watson," Holmes replied, turning slowly from the window. His voice was flat, carrying no inflection, yet it cut through the heavy air of the room. "We are dealing with chemistry, gravity, and human malice. There is no magic here. Only a very clever, very patient venom." He stepped past me, his long strides eating up the distance to the door. "We are going to the British Library," he announced, tossing my heavy overcoat toward me. "The answers are not in the blood of this unfortunate young man, nor are they in the ashes of those 13 candles. They are buried under 30 years of dust." The hansom cab ride through the sodden streets of London was undertaken in silence. The damp chill of the morning seeped through the floorboards, and the rhythmic clatter of hooves on wet cobblestones provided a steady cadence to my thoughts. I observed my companion closely. Holmes possessed an unnatural stillness when the scent of the quarry was strong in his nostrils. His profile was sharp as a hawk's, his eyes half closed, his mind retreating into that vast, organized attic of his intellect. I found myself reflecting on the macabre tableau we had witnessed the previous night. The 13 candles, the shattered mirror, the bizarre symbols drawn in chalk upon the floorboards. To my pragmatic mind, it smacked of madness, of a mind unhinged by dark obsessions. Yet Holmes had dismissed it all with a wave of his hand, calling it pantomime. We arrived at the imposing facade of the British Library as the great clock at Westminster chimed the 11th hour. The air inside the vast reading room was dry and thick, with the scent of decaying leather, binding glue, and the slow, inevitable oxidation of ancient paper. Dust motes danced in the shafts of pale light that pierced the high windows, settling upon the bowed heads of scholars and antiquarians. Holmes moved with absolute purpose, bypassing the general catalogues and striding directly toward the desk of the head archivist, a diminutive, bespectacled man whom Holmes had consulted on several previous occasions. "I require the trade gazettes, the civil court records, and the metropolitan obituaries for the years 1858 through 1860, Holmes said, his voice dropping to a low, urgent murmur. "Specifically, I am looking for any legal proceedings or bankruptcies involving the Harrington estate, Lord Thomas Harrington to be exact." The archivist blinked, scurried away into the labyrinth of towering shelves, and returned a quarter of an hour later, steering a heavy wooden cart laden with massive leather-bound ledgers. We commandeered a long oak table in the quietest corner of the room. The physical labor of the investigation began. For 2 hours, the only sounds were the scratching of nibs, the muted coughs of distant readers, and the dry, rhythmic rustle of turning pages. The paper of these old volumes was brittle, the ink fading into a sepia blur. I took the obituaries, scanning columns of forgotten lives, while Holmes devoured the legal registers with frightening speed. His index finger traced down the dense columns of type, his eyes flicking back and forth, entirely consumed by the hunt. The temperature in the reading room was oppressive, yet Holmes did not remove his coat. He was entirely separated from his physical surroundings, existing only in the abstract world of dates, names, and judgments. "There it is," Holmes said suddenly. His voice was barely a whisper, yet it struck my ears like a pistol shot. He did not point, nor did he look up from the heavy ledger. He simply pushed the massive volume across the scratched oak surface toward me. I leaned forward, adjusting my position to catch the meagre light. The entry was buried deep within the records of the Chancery Court, a dense paragraph of legalese detailing a property and patent dispute. I read the text slowly, translating the convoluted phrasing into plain English. Lord Thomas Harrington, Arthur's father, had brought a devastating lawsuit against a master glassmaker named Elias Thorne. The dispute centered upon a proprietary technique for the silvering of mirrors, a chemical process that yielded an unprecedented clarity and brilliance in the glass. Harrington, a wealthy investor, claimed prior ownership of the patent through a convoluted series of debts and foreclosures. Thorne, a craftsman with no legal counsel and dwindling funds, was systematically crushed by Harrington's endless legal maneuvering. "Read the addendum, Watson," Holmes instructed, his eyes fixed unblinkingly upon my face. I moved my gaze down the page. The court had ruled in Harrington's favour. The judgment mandated the immediate seizure of Thorne's workshop, his tools, his ledgers, and his home. The final sentence was a sterile bureaucratic note confirming the eviction of Elias Thorne and his family on a bitter January morning in 1859. "Now, Watson, look at the Gazette from 2 weeks later," Holmes said, producing a second, thinner volume and laying it atop the first. I opened it to the page he had marked with a strip of blank paper. It was a short, grim notice in the Metropolitan News section. The body of Elias Thorne had been pulled from the Thames near Blackfriars Bridge. His pockets had been filled with fragments of shattered mirror glass. The coroner had ruled it a desperate suicide. "A tragedy of greed," I murmured, sitting back in my hard wooden chair. "Harrington destroyed the man for a chemical process. He took his livelihood, his art, and ultimately his life." "He took more than that," Holmes said, his voice dropping to a glacial register. "Harrington stole the man's legacy. He built the Harrington fortune upon the stolen genius of a ruined craftsman. All the wealth Arthur currently enjoys, the fine house, the social standing, it is all built upon the drowned corpse of Elias Thorne." I looked at the ancient yellowed paper. The cruelty of it was stark and uncompromising. "But how does this connect to the horrors of the present?" I asked. "The mirror frame in Arthur's room, the 13 candles, the pentagrams. Elias Thorne was a glassmaker, not a sorcerer." "Precisely, Watson." Holmes leaned forward, his elbows resting upon the table, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin. "You have laid your finger upon the very crux of the matter. The occult trappings, the candles, the chalk symbols, they are nothing but a magnificent theatrical distraction. The perpetrator knew that Arthur's mind was fragile, steeped in Gothic literature and prone to superstitious terror. The enemy designed a nightmare to mask a murder. But why wait 30 years? I countered. If this is revenge for the destruction of Elias Thorne, why strike now upon the son, when the father who committed the sin has been dead for 5 years? Because vengeance is a dish that requires long simmering, Watson, and because the avenger was not capable of striking until now. Holmes reached out and tapped a single line in the obituary notice I had read earlier. I looked closely at the faded print. The notice mentioned that Elias Thorne was survived by a destitute wife who had succumbed to consumption in the workhouse shortly after his death, and a single child, a son. The boy was named Julian, Holmes said softly. He was 8 years old when he watched his father's life work stolen. He was 8 years old when he watched his father drown and his mother cough her life away in a pauper's ward. 30 years have passed, Watson. That helpless child is now 38, a man grown, a man with a lifetime to cultivate his hatred, to study chemistry, to master the art of glass-making, and to weave a plot so intricate it would destroy the Harrington line just as thoroughly as Lord Harrington destroyed the Thorneys. My blood ran cold as the absolute symmetry of the crime revealed itself. The elaborate mirror frame that had driven Arthur to the brink of madness was not a cursed relic. It was a custom-made weapon. The shattered glass in Arthur's room mirrored the shattered glass in the pockets of the drowned man. The sins of the father were being visited upon the son, exacting a toll in terror and blood. "We are looking for a man of 38, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "A man who understands mirrors, chemistry, and the architecture of the Harrington home." Holmes stood up, snapping the heavy ledger shut with a sound that echoed sharply through the cavernous reading room. The dust of 30 years gleamed into the air between us. "Yes, Watson," Holmes said, buttoning his long coat. "But we are looking for something far more specific than that. Look again at the court record detailing the seizure of Thorne's property, the precise nature of the stolen patent." I pulled the heavy book open once more, squinting at the faded ink. The text described Thorne's proprietary silvering method. It involved an amalgam of mercury, tin, and a highly volatile compound of arsenic. The breath caught in my throat. Arsenic. I remembered the clammy skin, the sluggish pupils, the scent of bitter almonds and singed wax in Arthur's bedchamber. It was not a mystical curse slowly draining the life from the young heir. It was a slow, deliberate poisoning, achieved through the fumes of the very glass he stared into every night. "We have wasted time looking for a phantom in the shadows," Holmes said, his eyes hard and unreadable. "The boy Julian did not grow up to be a vagabond. He grew up to be a gentleman. He infiltrated the Harrington life. He commissioned that frame. He placed the poison within the silvering. He is someone Arthur trusts completely." Holmes turned and walked swiftly toward the exit of the reading room, leaving me to scramble after him. I caught up to him on the wide stone steps of the library, the grey London rain now falling in a heavy, continuous sheet. "Who is it, Holmes?" I asked, the dread pulling cold and heavy in my stomach. "Who among Arthur's acquaintances matches this description?" Holmes paused on the steps, ignoring the rain that soaked his shoulders. He looked out over the sea of umbrellas navigating the crowded street. "Tell me, Watson," Holmes said, his voice entirely devoid of emotion. "When you examined Arthur this morning, did you happen to look closely at the signature on the chart left by the attending physician who first pronounced his condition a nervous collapse? The physician who has been prescribing him tinctures and tonics for the past 6 months?" I stopped dead. The memory of the chart at the foot of the bed rushed into my mind. The crisp, elegant handwriting. The name of the trusted family doctor who had unlimited access to Arthur Harrington, who had recommended he stay confined to his room, surrounded by the poisoned mirrors. "Dr. Julian Vance," I whispered, the name tasting like ash on my tongue. Holmes stepped out into the rain, and Dr. Vance Watson is currently alone in that house with our comatose patient. Chapter 7. The Ocean, the Carpet. The acrid bite of hydrochloric acid competed with the heavy sweet scent of melted paraffin within the sitting room of Baker Street. It was a miserable, weeping morning in London. The fog pressed against our windows like a damp wool blanket, deadening the rumble of the hansom cabs down below. I sat in my armchair by the empty grate, reading the morning papers, though my attention was repeatedly drawn to my companion. Sherlock Holmes had been at his makeshift chemical bench since before the winter dawn. His posture was rigid, his sharp profile cast in pale relief by the blue flame of the Bunsen burner. As a medical man, I noted the taut cords of tendon in his neck and the absolute stillness of his hands. He was operating at a pitch of high nervous energy, entirely absorbed in a glass watch glass containing a small, deformed lump of wax and a severed square of ruined carpet. He had not spoken a word for 3 hours. The silence was broken only by the deliberate ticking of the mantel clock and the occasional scrape of the glass stirring rod. This intense period of isolation was customary when his mind was unravelling a knot, and I knew better than to interrupt. The knot in question was the bewildering tableau of the 13 candles and the ornate mirror frame, a scene that had grown only more complex since the subsequent attack on Arthur. The heavy, rhythmic thud of boots upon our wooden stairs announced a visitor. The tread was deliberate, flat-footed, and entirely lacking in hesitation. I recognized the gait of an official policeman well before the sitting-room door opened to admit Inspector Lestrade. The Scotland Yard detective brought the damp chill of the street in with him. His sallow face was flushed and his chest heaved in a manner that suggested he had taken our stairs 2 at a time. He removed his bowler hat, shaking a fine mist of rain from its brim, and looked about the room with an air of immense satisfaction. "You are at your experiments early, Mr. A. Satisfaction." "You are at your experiments early, Mr. Holmes," Lestrade said, rubbing his cold hands together. "I hope you are not wasting your morning on the waxwork. The matter is concluded." Holmes did not raise his eyes from his work. He adjusted the flame of the burner by a fraction of an inch. "Concluded, Inspector. That is a heavy word for a Tuesday morning. I have seen enough of criminal desperation to know when a man is playing a part," Lestrade continued, stepping closer to the chemical table. "Arthur is our man. He arranged the entire ghastly display at the first crime scene to throw us off the scent of his own financial misdeeds. When he realized Scotland Yard was closing the net around him, he panicked. He staged the attack upon himself, inflicting his own wounds, hoping to play the victim and absolve himself of all suspicion. It is an old trick, Mr. Holmes. I have seen it a dozen times in the East End. I placed my newspaper upon the side table and observed the inspector. His theory possessed a crude, brutal logic. It was not unheard of for a guilty man to harm himself to create a false trail. Yet, recalling the severity of Arthur's pallor and the rapid, thready quality of his pulse after the attack, my medical instincts rebelled against the idea. A man might cut his own arm to feign an assault, but it took a rare breed of fanatic to inflict the level of trauma Arthur had sustained without a flinch. "You find a theory sound, Watson," Holmes murmured, reading my silence with that uncanny peripheral awareness he possessed. "I find it plausible in principle," I replied carefully, "but anatomically improbable. Arthur would have needed a remarkable pain tolerance to execute such a severe assault upon his own person without causing a defensive hesitation mark." Lestrade gave a dismissive wave of his hand. "Adrenaline and fear make men do remarkable things, Doctor. The fact remains, he had motive, he had access, and his behavior has been deeply erratic. I have a constable standing by his door. As soon as he is medically fit, I am placing him under arrest for the orchestrations of these crimes." Holmes finally extinguished the blue flame of his burner. The sudden hiss of the gas valve closing seemed very loud in the quiet room. He picked up a pair of brass tweezers and gently tapped the edge of the glass dish holding the wax and the ruined carpet square. He turned to face the inspector, his grey eyes piercing and utterly devoid of warmth. "It is a comforting narrative, Lestrade," Holmes said, his voice flat and precise. "It requires very little of your imagination and spares you the exertion of further footwork. There is only one minor flaw in your neat deduction. And what is that, Mr. Holmes? It is entirely impossible." Lestrade stiffened. His professional pride stung. "I have the evidence of my own eyes and the accumulated experience of the yard." "You have eyes, Lestrade, but you do not employ them to see," Holmes countered, taking up a magnifying lens. "Come here and look upon this glass dish. Tell me what you observe." Lestrade approached the table reluctantly, leaning over the pungent chemical bath. "I see a lump of melted wax and a piece of burned rug. The same rubbish we catalogued at the first scene." "You see the result, but you ignore the process," Holmes said. "This piece of carpet was cut from the exact center of the first crime scene, directly beneath the mirror frame where the 13 candles were arranged. Notice the wax. It is a very cheap blend of tallow and poor quality paraffin. I have spent the morning burning identical candles purchased from the same chandler. I have timed their consumption down to the fraction of a second. The ambient temperature of the room, accounting for the draft from the broken window latch, allows this specific wax to consume itself at a rate of 1 inch every 42 minutes. Lestrade crossed his arms. "I fail to see how the burn rate of cheap tallow changes the fact that Arthur placed them there." Holmes ignored the interruption, shifting his brass tweezers to point at a dark smudge trapped beneath the translucent pool of hardened wax. "Now, observe the carpet fibers beneath the dripping tallow. What do you see trapped inside the wax matrix?" "Ash," I offered, stepping forward to peer over Lestrade's shoulder. "Precisely, Watson, ash, but not just any ash." I leaned closer. The granular texture was distinct. "It is not cigar ash. It is too coarse, too dark." Holmes shot me a look of pure approval. "Excellent, Watson. It is not tobacco. It is coal ash, specifically the dense, sulfur-heavy residue produced by a railway engine. Furthermore, it is mixed with a microscopic trace of silicate and dried street mud. It is the precise composition of debris that would adhere to the heel of a heavy boot worn by someone walking along the railway embankments near King's Cross." Lestrade sighed heavily. "So our man walks near a train. Half of London walks near a train. Half of London walks near a train." Holmes set the lens down with a sharp click. The ash was pressed deep into the pile of the Persian carpet. The wax dripped directly over it, sealing it perfectly against the elements. This means the ash was deposited upon the carpet in the exact moments before the candles were lit. The heavy boot of our perpetrator stepped upon this spot, pivoted as he reached up to arrange the candles in the mirror frame, and left this residue. The wax then fell and preserved the footprint's dust like a fly in amber. Lestrade looked mildly irritated. "Even if I grant you the railway ash, how does this clear Arthur? He could have walked by the station before returning to set his little stage." "Because of the mathematics of the melting wax," Holmes stated, his voice ringing with absolute finality. "I have measured the depth of the unburned candle stubs found at the scene. By calculating the total volume of melted wax pooled upon this carpet square, and dividing it by the exact burn rate of this specific tallow blend, I can determine precisely how long those candles were burning before they were extinguished by the wind. They burned for exactly 2 hours and 10 minutes. I saw the trap closing, my mind racing ahead to the police logs. The candles were discovered by the charwoman at 6:30 in the evening. Holmes nodded to me. Exactly, Watson. Subtract 2 hours and 10 minutes from the time of discovery. The perpetrator stood upon this carpet, deposited the railway ash from his boot, and put a match to the first candle at precisely 20 minutes past 4 in the afternoon. Not a minute sooner, not a minute later. Lestrade shifted his weight, his confidence beginning to fracture. The precise time of ignition. But Arthur was unaccounted for that entire afternoon. Unaccounted for by Scotland Yard, perhaps, Holmes replied, but not by the Metropolitan Record. Yesterday evening, while you were building a case against an innocent man, I sent a series of telegrams to the constabularies of the East End. I traced Arthur's movements through his financial desperation. At precisely 20 minutes past 4 in the afternoon, the candles were lit. Arthur was standing in a pawnbroker's shop on Commercial Road in Stepney. Lestrade blinked, the colour draining from his sallow cheeks. Stepney, that is nearly an hour's drive from the crime scene. Indeed, Holmes said softly, and Arthur was not merely present in the shop. He was engaged in a violent, screaming dispute with the pawnbroker over the valuation of a silver pocket watch. The altercation became so heated that a local constable was summoned from the street to prevent a riot. The constable recorded the incident, took the names of both men, and logged the disturbance in the precinct book. The ink of that entry marks the time at precisely 4:15, and the constable remained on the premises with Arthur until 4:45. The silence in our sitting room was absolute, save for the ticking of the clock. Lestrade stared at the lump of wax, the foundations of his entire theory collapsing into dust. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. He could not have lit those candles, I said quietly, voicing the unavoidable truth. He was miles away, in the presence of a police officer, at the exact moment the perpetrator struck the match. Arthur is entirely innocent of orchestrating his own ruin, Holmes said, turning his back on the inspector to begin cleaning his chemical instruments. You will remove your man from his door, Lestrade, and you will begin searching for a man who wears heavy boots, frequents the railway lines, and harbours a hatred for Arthur profound enough to frame him so exquisitely. Lestrade gathered his hat, looking suddenly older and immensely tired. I shall make the necessary adjustments, Mr. Holmes. Good day to you. When the heavy tread of the inspector had faded down the stairs and the front door closed behind him, I looked at Holmes. He was not celebrating his victory over Scotland Yard. He had returned to the table, holding the severed piece of carpet under the magnifying lens once more, his brow deeply furrowed. The tense, nervous energy had not dissipated. It had concentrated into something darker. A brilliant deduction, Holmes, I said, moving to the fire to stir the dying coals. You have saved a man from the gallows. Holmes did not look up. He rotated the glass dish slowly under the light. I have saved a man from a false charge, Watson, but in doing so, I have exposed a much more terrifying geometry to this puzzle. What do you mean? Consider the timing, Watson, Holmes said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. Our perpetrator arranged 13 candles in a mirror frame, and lit them at 20 minutes past 4. He chose a moment when Arthur was miles away, drawing the attention of the police, securing an ironclad alibi. I turned from the fire, a cold prickle of unease travelling down my spine. Are you suggesting the murderer knew Arthur would be at the pawnbroker's shop at that exact hour? I am suggesting something far worse, Holmes replied, finally raising his eyes to meet mine. The grey depths were clouded with a sudden dreadful realization. I am looking at the residual dust trapped beneath the wax. I told Lestrade it was railway ash and street mud. I did not tell him what else the lens revealed in the grain of the soil. He slid the glass dish across the table toward me. I stepped forward and looked through the heavy magnifying lens. Among the black soot and brown mud there were tiny, distinct flakes of stark white material. Bone dust, Watson, Holmes said softly. Freshly ground. Our man did not merely follow Arthur. Our man is preparing the mirror frame for its actual purpose, and if my reading of this dust is correct, the 13 candles were never meant to be a message. They were meant to be a countdown. Chapter 8. The Mecca of Hilsians. The parlour of Elishans, the parlour of Elias Thorne, was a room built to deceive the eye. It belonged to a man whose lineage was steeped in the manipulation of light and sand, and the walls bore testament to that heritage. Convex lenses, silvered plates, and faceted sconces crowded the narrow chamber, throwing our reflections back at us in distorted fragments. The air was heavy with the smell of linseed oil, brass polish, and the faint, bitter tang of heated dust. Outside, the London evening had settled into a damp fog, but inside, the gas lamps burned with a harsh, steady glare. I stood near the hearth, keeping my back to the mantel, while Inspector Lestrade occupied the doorway, his thumbs hooked into his waistcoat, his boots squeaking faintly whenever he shifted his weight. Seated on a low settee was Elias Thorne himself, the glassmaker whose father had shaped the cursed object at the centre of our inquiry. Thorne was a man of 30 or so, but his stooped posture and the deep, permanent lines around his eyes gave him the aspect of an elder. His hands rested on his knees, the fingertips scarred and calloused from years of handling molten silica and sharp edges. Beside him sat Arthur Pendleton, the antiquarian who had brokered the sale of the mirror. Pendleton was sweating. A pale sheen coated his forehead, and his breathing was shallow, the respiration of a cornered animal. I noted the rapid pulse beating at the base of his neck, a stark contrast to Thorne, who possessed the terrifying stillness of a man waiting for the executioner. Holmes stood in the centre of the room. He had brought the mirror frame with him, stripped of its glass, and mounted it upon a wooden easel. The empty carved wood and brass structure looked like the ribcage of some grotesque beast. Holmes did not pace. He stood perfectly still, his long fingers resting lightly upon the ornate crest of the empty frame. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a murmur, yet it commanded the room completely. "We have gathered to discuss the mechanics of death," Holmes began. "Death, gentlemen, is rarely a masterpiece. It is usually the result of sudden passion, brute force, or desperate clumsiness. But occasionally, one encounters a murder that has been crafted with the meticulous care of a watchmaker. Such is the case of the 13 candles." Lestrade shifted his weight. "You told me you had the murderer, Mr. Holmes. I do not have time for an art lecture." "You have time for the truth, Lestrade," Holmes replied without looking at him. "The truth requires patience. Observe this frame." Holmes stepped aside, allowing us a clear view of the empty structure. Pendleton dabbed at his brow with a silk handkerchief. Thorne stared at the floor. I stepped forward to examine the object. The craftsmanship was undeniably exquisite. The wood was deeply carved with intertwined vines and grotesque faces, heavily gilded and seemingly solid. Sconces for 13 candles protruded from the lower edge, arranged in an asymmetrical sweeping arc. As a medical man, I am accustomed to looking beneath the surface, to seeking the bone beneath the skin, but I confess I saw nothing more than an antique curiosity. "It is heavy," Holmes said. "Far heavier than mahogany or oak would account for. Watson, place your hand upon the lower left quadrant. Tell me what you feel." I did as instructed. The surface was cold, much colder than the ambient temperature of the room. I tapped the wood. It did not yield the dull thud of solid timber, but a faint, metallic resonance. "Brass," I said, "and something else." "Lead?" "Precisely," Holmes said. "The wood is merely a veneer. The lower portion of this frame is a hollowed chamber, lined with lead and sealed with brass. It is not an antique at all. The wood has been artificially aged, treated with acid and soot to simulate the passage of 2 centuries. But the chamber inside is entirely modern. It is a pneumatic reservoir." Pendleton let out a small strangled gasp. "I knew nothing of this. I merely sold the piece. I swear it." Holmes ignored the outburst. The Venetian masters often built secret compartments into their furniture, but those were meant for jewels or documents. This chamber was built to hold vapor. It was pressurized. Lestrade conceived a step forward, his skepticism momentarily forgotten. Pressurized gas? In a mirror? How could such a thing be filled, let alone triggered? Holmes walked slowly around the easel. The filling was done through a microscopic valve hidden within the carved mouth of this gargoyle on the left flank. A simple bicycle pump, modified for the purpose, could introduce the gas until the internal pressure was immense. But the release mechanism is the true work of genius. It relies entirely on the final element of the victim's nightly ritual, the 13th candle. I thought back to the scene of the crime. The sprawling manor in Surrey. The victim, Lord Harrington, seated in his high-backed chair, his face a mask of frozen agony. The room had been sealed from the inside, no signs of struggle, no wounds. As I had examined the body, I had noted the distinct cyanosis of the lips and the peculiar lack of rigor mortis, both indicative of poisoning by an asphyxiating agent. Yet the air in the room had been perfectly clear by the time we forced the door. Lord Harrington was a creature of habit, Holmes continued. Every evening at 10 o'clock he retired to his study. He lit the 13 candles affixed to this mirror, poured himself a single glass of port, and read until the candles burned down. It was a well-known eccentricity. The architect of his demise knew this timeline perfectly. Holmes touched the rightmost sconce, the one positioned highest on the asymmetrical arc. The 13th candle. Observe the base of this particular sconce, Watson, Holmes directed. I leaned in close. The metal cup designed to hold the wax was completely ordinary, but beneath it, concealed within the decorative brass foliage, was a tiny aperture no larger than the eye of a needle. I pointed it out to Lestrade, who squinted at it with a frown. "That tiny hole killed a man?" Lestrade asked. "Not the hole, Lestrade. What came out of it," Holmes said. "The sconce is connected directly to the pressurized chamber via a narrow brass tube. However, the tube is blocked by a small, dense plug of jeweler's wax. Jeweler's wax has a very specific melting point. It requires sustained, direct heat to liquefy. The mechanics of the trap suddenly became horrifyingly clear to me. The candles, I said. As the 13th candle burns down over the course of an hour, the flame gets closer and closer to the brass sconce." Holmes nodded, a brief flash of approval in his eyes. "Exactly, Watson. For 55 minutes the victim sits in complete safety, bathed in the warm light of his own impending doom. The candle burns. The flame lowers. The brass sconce begins to heat. The heat transfers down the stem to the plug of jeweler's wax. At the very moment the candle gutters and dies, the plug melts." Holmes paused, allowing the weight of the mechanism to settle over the room. The silence was profound, broken only by Pendleton's ragged breathing and the distant clatter of a hansom cab on the cobblestones outside. "The pressure within the chamber is immediately released," Holmes said, his voice dropping an octave. "A concentrated burst of toxic vapor is expelled through the aperture. Given the angle of the sconce and the position of Harrington's favorite reading chair, the gas is delivered directly into the victim's breathing space. A sudden, massive dose. One inhalation is enough to paralyze the respiratory system. He cannot cry out. He cannot stand. He simply ceases to breathe." I felt a cold shudder run down my spine. The ingenuity was devilish. It weaponized a man's own routine against him, leaving behind no mechanism to reset, no visible poison in a cup. And because the gas dispersed into the large study and seeped out under the door overnight, the room was safe to enter by morning. The melted wax plug would simply look like the remnants of the burned candle. "A perfect locked-room murder," I murmured. "There is no such thing as a perfect murder, Doctor," Holmes corrected sharply. "The mechanism is flawless, yes, but the creator left fingerprints of another kind. The engineering of such a device requires highly specialized knowledge, a mastery of glass, metal, heat, and pressure." Holmes turned his piercing gaze upon the stooped figure of the glassmaker. Elias Thorne slowly raised his head. His eyes were red-rimmed, full of a strange mixture of terror and relief. "Your father was a master artisan, Mr. Thorne," Holmes said, "but he worked in sand and silver. He did not work in pneumatics. This frame was built recently. The tooling marks on the brass tubing inside the chamber were made by a modern lathe, a lathe identical to the one I observed in your workshop downstairs." Thorne let out a long, trembling breath. He did not deny the accusation. He looked at his scarred hands, turning them over as if they belonged to a stranger. "I built it," Thorne whispered. His voice was cracked, unused to speaking at length. "I built the frame. I hollowed the wood. I sealed the lead." Lestrade took a step toward the man, producing a pair of heavy iron cuffs from his coat. "Elias Thorne, I arrest you for the murder of Lord Harrington. You will hang for this." "Wait," I interjected, stepping between Lestrade and the glassmaker. "Zuck, look at the man, Lestrade." And the glassmaker. "Look at the man, Lestrade. He is terrified. He has the mechanical skill, certainly, but does he possess the motive? Lord Harrington was an aristocrat with a taste for antiques. What quarrel could a glassmaker have with an earl?" Holmes gave me a slight nod. "Watson is observant, as always. Thorne built the weapon. He did not deploy it." Thorne looked up at Holmes, his expression turning to one of profound pleading. "I swear to you, Mr. Holmes, I did not know what it was for. The man who paid me said it was a theatrical prop, an illusion for the stage. He gave me the blueprints. He provided the brass tubing. I simply followed his design." "And the gas?" Holmes asked. "I know nothing of gas," Thorne cried out. "I delivered the frame empty. I swear on my father's soul." Pendleton suddenly stood up, knocking his knees against the low settee. "If Thorne did not kill him, then who did? You brought us here to point fingers at an innocent craftsman." "Sit down, Pendleton," Holmes snapped. The authority in his voice hit the antiquarian like a physical blow, and Pendleton sank back into his seat. "I brought you here," Holmes said, pacing slowly now, his eyes fixed on the empty mirror frame, "because the execution of this murder tells us everything about the mind of the man who orchestrated it. He is a man who deals in antiquities, yes, but he also deals in chemistry. He understands the thermal properties of jeweler's wax and the deadly efficiency of hydrogen cyanide." I watched Holmes's face. His cheekbones seemed sharper in the gaslight, his eyes burning with that familiar restless fire. He was circling the truth, drawing the net tighter. "Thorne delivered the empty frame to the man who commissioned it," Hobbs continued. "That man then filled the chamber with the gas, brought it to Pendleton's gallery, and ensured it was sold specifically to Lord Harrington." Lestrade frowned. "But how could he guarantee Harrington would buy it?" "Because he knew Harrington had been hunting for the legendary Venetian mirror of the 13 candles for a decade," Holmes said softly. "The murderer simply manufactured the myth and then manufactured the mirror to match it." Holmes turned his back on the suspects and faced the empty frame on the easel. He reached out and touched the intricately carved gargoyle that hid the filling valve. His finger traced the dark wood, stopping suddenly. My breath caught in my throat. I knew that posture. It was the sudden rigidity of a hound catching a fresh scent. Holmes leaned closer to the frame, his nose nearly touching the wood. He brought his magnifying glass from his pocket and examined a tiny depression near the base of the mirror. "Watson," Holmes said, his voice entirely devoid of its previous theatrical projection. It was low, flat, and chilling. I stepped to his side. "What is it, Holmes?" He pointed to a minuscule marking stamped into the lead lining, just barely visible through a crack in the wooden veneer. It was a tiny crest, no larger than a peppercorn, a serpent wrapped around a broken sword. "Thorne," Holmes said without turning around, "when you built this frame according to the blueprints provided, did the client request that you stamp this maker's mark into the metal?" Thorne squinted at the mark. "No, Mr. Holmes, I put no mark there. The metal came from the client. He supplied the lead sheeting already cut to size." Holmes slowly lowered the magnifying glass. He did not look at Lestrade, he did not look at Lestrade, he did not look at Pendleton or Thorne. He stared into the empty space where the mirror glass should have been, his reflection absent, his mind already racing down a very dark and dangerous path. "Holmes," I pressed, feeling a creeping sense of unease settle into my bones. "What does the mark signify? You know whose seal that is." Holmes remained motionless for a long time. When he finally spoke, the air in the room seemed to turn infinitely colder. "I do, Watson," he murmured. "And if that man supplied the blueprints for this mechanism, then we have made a terrible miscalculation." He turned to face us, his eyes wide and dark in the harsh gaslight. "Harrington was not the target," Holmes said. "He was merely a test subject." He looked back at the 13 sconces, his jaw tight. "Tell me, Thorne," Holmes demanded, his voice suddenly sharp as a blade. "Tell me, Thorne," Holmes demanded, his voice suddenly sharp as a blade, "when you build this frame, exactly how much lead cheating did the client provide?" Thorne swallowed hard, shrinking back from the intensity of the detective's gaze. "Enough for 2, Mr. Holmes," the glassmaker whispered. "I built 2 of them." Holmes stared at him, the silence in the room stretching until it felt ready to snap. "Then may God help us," Holmes said softly, "for somewhere in London tonight another 13th candle is already burning." Chapter 9. The Broken Reflection. The fire in the grate had burned down to a sullen, pulsing red glow, casting long and wavering shadows across the damp plaster walls of the Harrington drawing-room. The air within the high-ceilinged chamber was close and suffocatingly heavy, carrying the faint, cloying scent of wet soot, old varnish, and dried lavender. Sherlock Holmes stood perfectly motionless upon the centre hearthrug, his tall ascetic frame sharply silhouetted against the dying embers. In his left hand he held a single partially melted candle, its surface mottled and entirely uneven. He turned it slowly between his long, pale fingers, his sharp grey eyes fixed not upon the wax but upon the rigid figure of Arthur Harrington seated opposite him. I observed the young heir closely from my quiet vantage point, near the heavy velvet draperies of the window. As a medical man and a former army surgeon, I am intimately accustomed to reading the silent, involuntary language of the human body, and Arthur Harrington was broadcasting his profound guilt to anyone who knew how to look. His complexion, which had possessed a healthy sporting pink only yesterday morning, had drained completely to the sickly hue of old vellum. A fine, glittering sheen of cold perspiration coated his forehead and upper lip. I watched the rapid erratic flutter of his carotid pulse beating wildly against the edge of his stiff white collar. He sat with his hands resting heavily upon his knees, the knuckles completely devoid of blood from the immense force of his grip. He breathed in shallow, jagged gasps, adopting the unmistakable posture of a hunted animal, anticipating the drop of the gallows trap. "A family curse is a remarkably convenient instrument of murder," Holmes began, his voice perfectly level and devoid of any theatricality. "It requires no physical weapon to be hidden in a river. It demands no complicated alibi. Best of all, it frightens away the very authorities who ought to be examining the empirical evidence. The local constabulary hears whispers of occult revenge and ancient family blights, and they immediately suspend their rational faculties. They begin looking for ghosts in the shadows, where they should be looking for fingerprints upon the door frames." Arthur swallowed hard, his throat working convulsively beneath his cravat. "I do not know what you mean, Mr. Holmes. You are speaking madness. My father and my uncle were taken by the family blight, just as my grandfather was. The mirror has claimed them. You saw the locked bedchambers yourself. You saw that no living man could have entered or exited those rooms. I saw solid oak doors locked securely from the inside." "Yes," Holmes replied, taking a single, measured step forward. "But spirits of the dead do not require iron locks, Mr. Harrington. Phantoms do not possess the physical density to turn heavy brass keys. Living men turn keys, and living men are exceedingly easily manipulated by the quiet application of chemistry." Holmes held the deformed candle up to the dim light of the gas lamp, allowing the flame to illuminate the irregular pockets in the wax. "You were exceptionally thorough in your dark preparations. You understood perfectly that to eliminate 3 senior members of your own bloodline without drawing the immediate and unrelenting suspicion of Scotland Yard, the deaths must appear utterly inexplicable. They must seem to be the undeniable work of the cursed mirror frame of 13 candles. Therefore you ensured the 13 candles were present at the exact hour of each demise. What the rural police failed entirely to recognize was that the candles were not the macabre theatrical dressing of the crime scene. They were the murder weapon itself." The disjointed pieces of the grim puzzle suddenly aligned in my mind with the jarring, unmistakable clarity of a fractured bone snapping back into its socket. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, recalling the dreadful scene of the elder Harrington's death. I remembered the oppressive, unnatural heat of the locked room when we finally broke down the door. I remembered the peculiar, vivid blue tint to the dead man's lips and the dark petechial hemorrhages spotting the delicate whites of his eyes. At the time of the discovery, the local coroner and I had attributed these grim signs to a sudden catastrophic failure of the heart brought on by sheer unadulterated terror. We had been utterly blind. Stripped of the supernatural context, the medical signs were the classic, undeniable indicators of acute systemic asphyxia. "Tallow is a particularly crude and unpleasant substance," Holmes continued, pacing slowly across the worn, faded pattern of the Persian carpet. "It is rendered animal fat, highly prone to smoking and producing foul odors. It is also remarkably easy to melt down and recast in the privacy of one's own quarters. You purchased a large quantity of pure, unscented wax from a disreputable chandler in the labyrinthine alleys of Stepney. I visited the proprietor yesterday evening while you believed I was interviewing the groundskeeper. The chandler remembered your transaction vividly. He recalled a gentleman in a heavy grey ulster, paying in solid gold sovereigns, asking particularly detailed questions about the burning temperature and melting rates of various low-grade waxes. Once you had secured the raw material, you required the topsicant," Holmes said, stopping his pacing and locking his piercing gaze onto Arthur. "You required a volatile chemical compound that would remain entirely dormant when cool and solid, but would vaporize rapidly and lethally upon sustained combustion. You chose a dangerous derivative of acomatine, blended skillfully with an organic cyanide compound. I've found the microscopic traces of the powder, along with the distinct scoring marks of a heavy porcelain mortar and pestle, in the discarded ash of your private study grate. When lit by your hand, these 13 adulterated candles released a potent, odorless, and completely invisible vapor into the stagnant, unventilated air of the bedchambers. It is a lie," Arthur hissed, though the violent tremor in his jaw betrayed him completely. It is a fabrication from beginning to end. Even if I had made such candles, how could I possibly lock the heavy door from the inside? How could I leave my father and my uncle sealed inside their rooms with the key remaining in the lock? Holmes stood perfectly still. His sharp features were entirely devoid of sympathy or triumph. "You did not lock the doors," he stated coldly. "They locked the doors themselves." Arthur recoiled slightly, as if struck by a physical blow. The first physiological symptom of the vaporized toxin you employed is not immediate muscular paralysis, but an acute, terrifying cerebral disturbance, Holmes explained, his words dropping like stones into the silence of the room. It induces an intense localized paranoia, severe visual and auditory hallucination. As the deadly fumes began to fill the enclosed space, your father and later your uncle experienced an overwhelming, unnatural sense of dread. Their poisoned minds convinced them that the ancient curse was physically coming for them from the dark corridors of this very house. In their chemically induced, blind terror, they rushed to the heavy oak doors, turned the iron key, and shot the brass bolt to keep the phantom out. They sealed themselves inside their own execution chamber. Once the door was firmly locked, the concentration of the lethal vapor increased exponentially as the 13 candles burned down. Total paralysis of the respiratory system followed within minutes. They suffocated in silence. You had only to light the wicks, bid your family a pleasant evening, step into the hallway, and wait for the inevitable click of the lock. Arthur Harrington seemed to physically shrink within his tailored clothes. The rigid defensive tension that had held him upright for the past hour suddenly and completely snapped. He slumped forward heavily, burying his ashen face in his trembling hands. The dreadful sound that escaped his throat was a ragged, wet sob, the miserable and pathetic noise of a cornered man entirely undone by his own ruthless cleverness. "It was the debts," the young man whispered, his broken words muffled against his palms. "The estate is rotting from beneath us. The foundation is sinking into the mud. My father stubbornly refused to sell the timber rights. My uncle flatly refused to liquidate his investments in the city. They were perfectly content to sit in this decaying mausoleum and watch the Harrington name sink into total bankruptcy. I had to save myself. I had to take control before there was nothing left to inherit. The mirror was already feared by the ignorant servants. It was so remarkably simple to let the old, stupid legend do the bloody work for me." Holmes turned his head and gestured silently toward the heavy double doors of the drawing-room. Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard had been waiting patiently in the adjacent hallway, having heard every single word of the damning, tearful admission. He stepped swiftly into the room, his heavy police boots sounding uncomfortably loud and final against the polished floorboards. Without uttering a single word, Lestrade hauled the weeping heir roughly to his feet, securing his wrists behind his back with a cold, metallic snap that echoed sharply off the high plaster ceiling. I watched in profound silence as the murderer was led away into the damp, unforgiving night. As the front door closed in the distance, the grand, decaying house suddenly felt exceedingly hollow and cold. I released a long, deep breath, feeling the persistent muscular tension begin to drain from my stiff shoulders. It was a brilliant masterstroke of deduction, Holmes. You have saved the remaining members of the household from a truly terrible and calculated fate. Holmes did not reply immediately. He had turned entirely away from me and was standing silently before the massive tarnished brass mirror frame that dominated the far wall of the drawing-room. The 13 empty metal sconces jutted outward from the frame like skeletal fingers gripping the shadowed glass. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat, produced his silver magnifying glass, and leaned remarkably close to the dark reflective surface. His unnatural silence stretched on for so long that I felt a sudden, renewed prickle of cold unease manifest at the base of my neck. "What is it, Holmes?" I asked, stepping cautiously closer to his stooped figure. "The grim business is concluded, is it not?" Holmes remained absolutely motionless, his breath fogging the ancient glass. He ran a single, gloved fingertip along the inner edge of the heavy frame, tracing a dark, narrow crevice hidden deep within the ornate brasswork. "Arthur Harrington is a desperate, financially ruined young man with only a rudimentary schoolboy grasp of basic chemistry," Holmes murmured, his voice incredibly low, barely rising above the rhythmic sound of the rain lashing against the tall window panes. But the mechanical precision required to properly synthesize and stabilize this specific cyanide compound with an animal tallow is the complex work of an advanced, highly meticulous artisan. Arthur was the clumsy hand that lit the match, Watson. But as I look into this glass, I am looking at the reflection of the brilliant, utterly ruthless mind that actually formulated the wax. Holmes slowly lowered the magnifying glass, his profile entirely illuminated by a sudden flash of lightning from the storm outside. And looking at the heavy ancient mirror, I realized with a sudden paralyzing certainty that the true calculating author of the Harrington curse had not been led away in handcuffs but was still breathing the cold air of this very house. Chapter 10. The smoke curse. The heavy iron carriage doors closed with a hollow resonance that seemed to echo down the entire length of the cobblestone street. The thick London fog had rolled in from the Thames, a suffocating miasma of yellow vapour that clung to the damp brickwork and swallowed the silhouettes of Inspector Lestrade and his men. Between the constables walked Elias Vance, his wrists bound in heavy iron, his shoulders stooped under a burden that was no longer physical. I watched him closely in the shifting gaslight. There was no tremor of fear in his gait, no erratic panting of a trapped animal. His pulse, I surmised from the steady rhythm of his carotid artery above his frayed collar, was as slow and methodical as a man resting in his armchair. The fire of his 13-year vendetta had burned itself into ash, leaving behind only the frail shell of a man who had finally exhausted his life's singular purpose. Holmes stood beside me on the wet pavement, his collar turned up against the biting chill. He did not watch the carriage depart. His sharp aquiline profile was turned toward the dark facade of the Blackwood townhouse, studying the empty windows as though reading a text only he could see. The silence between us stretched, filled only by the muffled clatter of hooves retreating into the mist and the distant mournful call of a river barge. We secured a hansom at the corner of the square. The ride back to Baker Street was conducted in total silence. The damp wool of our coats filled the small cab with the scent of wet sheep and city soot, a sharp contrast to the coppery taint of blood that had dominated our evening. I watched Holmes in the flickering shadows cast by the passing street lamps. His eyes were half closed, his long thin fingers steepled beneath his chin. The energy that had animated him during the pursuit, the electric, predatory focus, had vanished. It was replaced by a profound and heavy stillness. The transition from the bleak misery of the London streets to the cosy, familiar confines of 221B Baker Street was a sudden shock to the senses. Mrs. Hudson had anticipated our return, leaving the gas lamps turned low and a robust coal fire crackling in the grate. The dry heat of the room was a balm to my chilled bones. I discarded my heavy coat and moved directly to the sideboard. The heavy crystal decanter felt grounding in my grip. I poured a stout measure of French brandy into 2 glasses, the rich amber liquid catching the ambient light of the flames. I handed a glass to Holmes, who had immediately retreated to his favoured armchair, drawing his knees up toward his chin in his habitual posture of contemplation. He took the glass without a word, staring deeply into the hearth. The silence was not uncomfortable, but it was heavy with the weight of the evening's revelations. The case of the mirror frame and its 13 grim markers had reached its inexorable end, but the closure felt deeply unsatisfactory. Lestrade would have his triumph. The Yard would take the credit for capturing the phantom who had terrorized the Blackwood estate. The local papers would print sensational headlines by morning, yet I could not help but think of the survivors left in the wake of this generational tragedy. Lady Eleanor had been spared the final physical blow of Vance's meticulous wrath, but she was now the sole inheritor of a poisoned legacy. Her father's past, the original sin that had birthed Vance's monstrous retribution, was now public record. She would carry the permanent stain of the Blackwood name, isolated in that grand, echoing house, surrounded by the invisible ghosts of 13 ruined lives. The law had protected her from murder, but the truth had ruined her standing in society forever. The psychological toll of such singular obsession is akin to a slow-acting neurotoxin, I noted aloud, taking a seat opposite my friend and letting the burn of the brandy settle in my chest. Vance spent over a decade constructing a monument to his own grief. Every candle he placed upon that intricate mirror frame was an act of slow suicide. He killed Lord Blackwood, but he truly died himself 13 years ago on the docks. Holmes held his glass to the fire, observing the refraction of the light through the crystal. He will not survive to see the gallows, Watson. I paused, the rim of my glass hovering near my lips. You believe he will take his own life in the holding cells? I believe he already has, Holmes replied smoothly. You are a medical man. You stood no more than 3 feet from him on the pavement. What did you observe? His pulse was remarkably steady, I answered, recalling the scene in the fog. His demeanour was calm, resigned. And his physical constitution? He was pallid. His breathing was shallow, though I attributed that to the damp river air. There was a faint yellowish tinge to the sclera of his eyes, suggesting hepatic distress. Holmes lowered his glass. Precisely, jaundice, shallow respiration, the pallor of failing kidneys. Vance steeped those 13 wicks in a compound of arsenic and white phosphorus. For 13 years he has been carefully melting and moulding that fatal mixture in the unventilated confines of his basement. He knew the severe toxicity of the vapours. He inhaled them deliberately as he worked. He designed his vengeance to ensure that he would expire alongside his creation. Lestrade has arrested a ghost. A cold realization washed over me, chilling the warmth the brandy had just provided. Vance had orchestrated every detail, including his own slow execution. He had left nothing to chance, and certainly nothing to the justice system. Revenge is a curious poison, Holmes continued, his voice pitched low, smooth, and devoid of its usual sharp edge. It requires the poisoner to consume it daily, in small doses, until they are entirely immune to the warmth of the world, yet wholly consumed by their own internal fire. Vance was a man of extraordinary intellect. Had he applied that mind to commerce, to science, or even to the arts, he might have reshaped a corner of this world for the better. Instead, he chose to build a prison of glass, ensuring that wherever he looked, he saw only the reflection of his own unhealed wound. I nodded slowly, recognizing the tragic truth in his words. And yet, I countered respectfully, one cannot entirely dismiss the origin of that wound. Lord Blackwood was a monster hiding behind a title and a vast fortune. The law was completely blind to his crimes. He operated with absolute impunity. Had Vance not taken the scales of justice into his own hands, Blackwood would have died a celebrated and respected man rather than a disgraced one. Holmes fixed his grey eyes upon me with a piercing intensity. That is the eternal flaw of our civilized society, my dear doctor. We mistake the letter of the law for the sum total of justice. They are not the same. The law is a blunt instrument. It is forged by fallible men to maintain public order. It is rigid. It is devoid of nuance. It frequently fails those who need it most. Justice requires balance. It requires an understanding of the human soul. He paused, taking a deliberate sip of his drink. Vance achieved a form of justice tonight, Holmes stated flatly, but it was a feral, untamed justice. By stepping outside the bounds of the law, he became the very thing he sought to destroy. He became a force of arbitrary ruin. The law will now punish him not for being wrong in his assessment of Lord Blackwood, but for usurping the state's monopoly on execution. There is no mercy in the gallows, Watson, just as there was no mercy in the 13 candles. His words hung in the warm air of our sitting room, a stark reminder of the cold reality that governed our profession. We were agents of the truth, occasionally agents of the law, but we were rarely purveyors of absolute justice. The world was too fractured, too deeply compromised to allow for such neat resolutions. I thought of Lestrade, likely writing his report under the harsh light of the precinct gas lamps at this very moment, ticking boxes and compiling timelines. To the inspector, a crime had been committed, an investigation conducted, and an arrest made. The ledger was balanced. He would not lose a single moment of sleep over the rotting foundations of the Blackwood Empire, nor would he spare a thought for the brilliant broken mind of Elias Vance slowly expiring in a damp cell at Newgate. It is a heavy burden, I said quietly, setting my empty glass upon the wooden table. To see the machinery of the world so clearly, and to know how frequently its heavy gears grind the innocent and the guilty alike into the exact same dust. Holmes offered a fleeting, melancholic expression that did not quite reach his eyes. That is why we must focus entirely on the work, Watson. The puzzle, the unravelling of the thread. If we were to dwell too long upon the grand machinery of human suffering, we would find ourselves paralyzed by the sheer weight of it. We bring order to the immediate chaos. We illuminate the shadowed corners. That must be enough. With that, Holmes set his glass aside and rose from his chair. The sudden movement dispelled the heavy, philosophical atmosphere that had settled over us. He stretched his long limbs, his joints popping faintly in the quiet room. "The hour is late, and the Thames fog has crept into my bones," he announced, his tone returning to its usual crisp cadence. "I shall retire. Tomorrow the sun will rise, the streets will clear, and London will undoubtedly present us with a fresh tapestry of deceit. Good night, Watson." "Good night, Holmes," I replied, watching as he disappeared into his bedchamber, the door clicking softly shut behind him. I remained in the sitting room for a long while, listening to the settling of the coals in the grate and the distant, muffled sounds of the sleeping city. The brandy had provided a temporary warmth, but a persistent hollow chill lingered in my chest. I moved to my small writing desk near the window, turning up the wick of my own lamp. I opened my leather-bound journal, the blank page staring back at me, waiting to receive the final record of the mirror frame and its grim adornments. I wrote steadily, detailing the deductions, the pursuit, and the inevitable capture. I recorded the facts exactly as they occurred, ensuring the narrative remained fiercely faithful to the truth of the events. Yet, as I set my pen down and looked out through the rain-streaked glass into the impenetrable yellow mist of Baker Street, I felt the profound absence of a moral victory. The case was closed, the culprit secured, the victim avenged, and the truth revealed. But there was no triumph to be found in the ledger tonight. There was only the tragedy of a man who had stared so long into the reflection of his own hatred that he forgot the face of his own humanity. On the desk beside my inkwell sat a single unlit wax candle, a spare from Mrs. Hudson's cupboards. It stood tall, perfectly formed, possessing the ultimate potential for light, yet remaining completely cold and silent in the shadows.